Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, Parallel Deku, back with another fanfiction. This is the series of What If Deku Awakened a Hidden Telekinesis Quirk. Now before starting, please give this video a like. And subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. All Might had told him he could not be a hero. Izuku Midoriya remembered that as he walked down the street and noticed a crowd gathered around a fight. He moved closer and saw Katsuki Bakugo trapped by a sludge villain while bystanders focused on guiding civilians to safety and stalling so they would not have to engage the villain directly. Izuku reached out instinctively and felt a warmth in his hand. He concentrated on Katsuki and the villain. His hands began to glow and both figures shimmered in midair. No one seemed to notice him. He pulled his hands apart, dropping Katsuki gently but keeping the sludge-like enemy suspended. The villain felt oddly light compared to how it had seemed when it grabbed someone else. Before anyone could identify who had intervened, Izuku guided the creature back into the bottle it had come from and used his quirk to propel himself home. At home, Izuku turned on the television. A news anchor reported that a new, unnamed hero had rescued Katsuki Bakugo and that the unknown savior appeared to have telekinetic abilities. Footage showed the quirk in use but not the user. Izuku laughed aloud at the broadcast. His mother entered to see why he was amused and asked what was so funny. He stopped laughing, switched to a closer shot on the screen, and then demonstrated quietly for her by suspending a glass of water in midair before drinking from it. He pointed out the similarity between the footage and his demonstration, smiling. His mother apologized for doubting him and embraced him, and she announced she was making katsudon to celebrate. Izuku retreated to his room with a plan. If his power was telekinetic, he needed to train it and strengthen his body. He tried lifting his bed and found it easy. Nothing at home was heavy enough to challenge his control. He decided the beach would provide the resistance he needed and set a strict schedule for himself. 5 to 6 o'clock, run around town. 6 to 7 o'clock, get ready for school. 7 to 14:30, school. 14:30 to 1500 hours, eat. 15 to 1700 hours, clean the beach. 17 to 1900 hours, combat training. 19 to 1930, eat. 1930 to 2030, homework. 2030 to 2100 hours, prepare for bed. 21 to 2200 hours, free time. 2200 hours, sleep. His mother called that dinner was ready, and Izuku went to eat, wondering how Katsuki would react now that he had been rescued. The next day at school, Izuku kept his head down as he entered the classroom. His desk had been scrawled with cruel messages telling him to die. He took a tissue, wiped the desk clean, and sat with a small, resilient smile as if nothing had happened. He considered a petty, retaliatory prank on Katsuki's seat but held back. He had never experienced anything like the notes before yesterday, when Katsuki had told him to jump off the roof. Just then, other students mentioned the earlier remarks about the rooftop. Katsuki arrived, calling him names as usual. Izuku pulled out a notebook and began to write. When Katsuki demanded to know what he was writing, Izuku cleared his throat and composed a dramatic note, pretending it was a farewell confessing that the world had been unbearable and apologizing for leaving. He signed the note with his name and then read the final line aloud in a brighter tone, as though teasing a reaction. Katsuki's expression shifted through terror, rage, and something like helplessness. He snatched the note and burned it, making his anger clear. Izuku confronted him, close enough that their faces were inches apart. He reminded Katsuki that telling someone to jump off the roof had contributed to the cruelty he faced, and he accused him of caring more about his own reputation and chances to enter UA than the well-being of others. He admitted loudly that he was quirkless, a fact he had not planned to reveal so confrontationally, and watched satisfaction cross Katsuki's face as the other students reacted in stunned silence. Izuku apologized for losing his temper and assured Katsuki there was no need to worry further. The rest of the day passed without further incident. Katsuki avoided bringing up the episode, and Izuku preferred to keep it that way. He resolved to begin his journey toward becoming a new symbol of peace, determined to do it on his own terms. Izuku had decided that today he would get into UA. He would not let Katsuki dictate anything. He had been training for 10 months and his physical condition was good enough, he believed. He saw a girl with short brown hair and big brown eyes almost trip, and he used his quirk to steady her. Izuku apologized for not asking permission and explained that tripping could be bad luck on a first day. The girl, Uraraka, thanked him and introduced herself as Uraraka before hurrying toward the front. Izuku noted she seemed sweet, but he had no time to think about it. He ran into the room where orientation was being explained. The hero present mic announced that everyone should say hello. The hero amplified his voice to ear-piercing levels. A boy with dark blue hair yelled that someone should stop mumbling, and all eyes turned to Izuku. Laughter followed. Izuku resolved to beat the boy during training. When Uraraka appeared again with untied shoes, Izuku started to warn her. The blue-haired boy interrupted angrily, accusing him of risking the girl's future. Izuku insisted the girl's shoes were untied, and when the boy seemed flustered, Izuku sarcastically suggested he had been memorizing rules, which only made the boy more embarrassed. The boy offered a formal apology and a deep bow. Izuku accepted with a smile, thinking he had weathered worse. Present Mike barked that there was no countdown for villains and signaled the start. Izuku went first. Using his quirk, he lifted himself into the air, spotted a robot 50 meters away, and struck it while flying, destroying it in midair. Suddenly he saw Uraraka about to be crushed by a 0-point robot. Memory of taunts claiming he was too weak surfaced. He told himself he would never save anyone, the old doubts echoing. Without thinking, Izuku cut his quirk and hurled himself toward the ground. Just before impact he clenched both fists. One brace caught him and the other destroyed the robot, lifting its wreckage into the air and sending it flying away. He landed and ran to Uraraka, using his quirk to lift debris off her. Izuku asked if she was okay and reached out to help her. Uraraka said she was fine and thanked him, admitting that without his help she might have been seriously hurt. She grabbed his hand to steady herself and then regained her balance. He recognized a small playful stumble she used to break the tension. She looked flustered and apologized before hurrying off. Izuku noted it was no problem. When the scores were announced, Katsuki had scored 72 points while Izuku had scored furious. Izuku punched the side of a training building. Part of it cracked and collapsed under the impact. Afterward, Izuku wanted nothing more than to go home. Uraraka called after him, waving to catch his attention. She handed him a slip of paper with her phone number and asked him to call if he ever needed a friend, adding a shy tone as she did so. Izuku accepted the paper and, before he left, asked her to explain her quirk. Uraraka demonstrated gravity manipulation by making a pebble float. Izuku complimented her vocabulary in an old-fashioned way, which made her blush and run off, clearly embarrassed. At home, Izuku's mother bombarded him with questions about the test, whether he had been hurt, and what his score was. He answered that the test had gone well, he was not hurt, the other students had not been mean, he had made friends, and his score had been 50. His mother expressed concern when she noticed burns on his arms and asked where they had come from. Izuku checked his arms and saw minor burns that he had not noticed. He offered several half-joking explanations about overexerting his quirk, a new aspect of it manifesting, or Katsuki sabotaging him, and then realized he was rambling. He told his mother he was going to bed. The apartment was spare. After donating most of their furniture, they lived with plain white walls, a bed covered by a simple sheet, a modest desk that held his quirk analysis journals, and a bookshelf with many books. Only the industrial gym equipment gave the room any personality, and Izuku liked it that way. He slipped into bed and fell asleep. Later, while working on his quirk analysis journal, a troubling thought returned. How had he been declared quirkless? The doctor had said he did not have a quirk, but the possibility that the doctor had been wrong kept nagging him. As the thought of being lied to surfaced, the room began to shake. Izuku realized his quirk had been acting up and the vibrations stopped as suddenly as they had begun. He reminded himself that he could not afford a temper like Katsuki's and went outside to clear his head. Izuku told his mother he was going out for a bit as he put on his coat. His mother told him to be home before dinner and to be careful. Izuku reassured his mother that he was always careful as he closed the door. I began walking toward the hospital. Even though I had not been here since I was 4, I remembered the way vividly. I had been bouncing in my car seat back then, thinking this was the most important car ride of my life. It ended with me believing I was quirkless. This doctor better have a good explanation, or I might lose my temper. I was lost in thought so long that I was already at the building. Going through the front would have been the most logical choice, but I wanted to be thorough. I walked around the back of the building and noticed a cracked window. Luck felt like a second quirk. Inside the room were glass jars filled with liquids of different colors. Then a door unlocked at the front of the building. I used my quirk to lift myself up and hide over the roofline and saw the same doctor come outside. A rough, dry voice on a phone berated the doctor about a missing quirk, calling it their most powerful and demanding to know when it had gone missing. The doctor began to apologize and explained that during the sludge villain incident an emergency broadcast had startled him and he had knocked over the jar, but the voice cut him off and demanded all the details before ending the call with a cold remark implying pity. After a while the coast seemed clear. Those people were right, someone who would steal quirks was despicable. I lowered myself to the front of the building and used my quirk like a key to open the door. Inside, the reception area led to a normal-looking doctor's office, but I went straight to the back room where a large machine stood. I recognized it. It was supposed to read quirks. I turned the machine on and navigated to an analysis section, then selected the year of my visit. What I found shocked me. Under my name in the M section, alongside basic details, a quirk was listed. The machine identified the quirk as telekinesis. It noted that at my current age I could lift about 500 pounds and that, when I became very angry, I could cause objects to flare or ignite with my mind. Those emotional bursts could influence temperature. It also mentioned a reduced susceptibility to fire-based quirks. The weakness entry explained that overexerting the ability or using it before the body had time to prepare could cause mild burns to the area where the quirk was used. I could not believe it. I had never been quirkless. Rage flared inside me. This machine was designed for cataloging quirks and for taking them. I summoned my power, and a small flare sparked around my hand. I remembered the machine kept logs of its last used profiles. I scrolled to one marked as deceased, then forced the power to erupt and damage the console. The sprinklers came on, and I smashed several jars as water began to rinse the room. I grabbed a component from the machine, ran for the security office, and found the exact room by luck. The laptop was still on. I deleted that day's footage, shut off the cameras, and ran outside. I did not want to be caught. Even though I believed I had done something right, they could twist it into breaking and entering. I reached my doorstep in seconds. When I opened the door, my mother bombarded me with questions about my whereabouts and a mention of the UA letter. I cut her off and demanded whether the letter had arrived. When she handed it to me, I opened it and read that I had passed the entrance exam with the highest score and that UA looked forward to my arrival. I could not contain my joy. I had scored higher than Katsuki. I grinned wider than I had in a long time. I thought to myself that now it would be interesting to see who would be the #1 hero. My first day at UA was just as big, clean, and impressive as I remembered. I saw Katsuki in the crowd and expected him to yell at me about being a quirkless loser who did not deserve such a score, not knowing I had saved him months earlier. 10 months of quirk training had taught me battle strategy, including the value of making the first move when an opponent was distracted. Apart from a previous stunt, Katsuki still had no idea who I really was. I approached him and greeted him. Katsuki grabbed my collar and barked that his name was Kaken and that I should remember it. He then looked startled as if he had not realized what he had said, and I decided to take advantage of the moment. I released my collar hold, placed his hand over my heart, and teased him that I had not known he cared so much, saying the last part playfully. Katsuki still thought I was the same timid kid from middle school, so he did not read the tone the way I intended. Katsuki did not yell or kick. He blushed bright red and stood completely still. Izuku said goodbye using the nickname Kaken. Katsuki stammered a return goodbye to Deku. Izuku thought it was strange that Katsuki seemed upset when the nickname was not used, and the small exchange left him pleasantly surprised. Lost in thought, Izuku reached his classroom and found about 20 students gathered in groups. One student with grape-like hair was causing a disturbance. Izuku took a photo as evidence and then intervened. He grabbed the student's hand and told him his behavior was inappropriate, then showed the picture. The student reacted with mortification. The teacher entered and asked about the commotion. Izuku explained the situation and presented the photograph as proof. The teacher declared that the student, Minoru Mineta, was expelled and ordered him to leave. Mineta protested briefly but complied. The teacher contacted Principal Nizu to report the expulsion and confirmed that Mineta would be sent over. An announcement over the speaker then requested that Hitoshi Shinso report to Class 1A. Shortly after, a young man with tired eyes and wild purple hair entered. The teacher told Shinso that his seat would be behind Midoriya and instructed him to dress into the P uniform. Izuku went to his locker, found the P uniform already there, and began changing. A tall student with red, spiky hair approached from behind and slapped Izuku's back, complimenting his physique. Izuku thanked him. The red-haired student introduced himself as Eijiro Kirishima and invited Izuku to have lunch together. Izuku accepted. From the corner of his ear came a grunt from Katsuki, and Izuku wondered if Katsuki might be feeling jealous. After changing, they walked out to the training grounds, which were impressive even in the open air. The instructor explained that they would be testing quirks in different scenarios with points awarded for performance, and that the person with the lowest score would be expelled. The announcement of the stakes made Izuku tense. He resolved not to be the one with the lowest score. The group ended the briefing with a mutual call to push themselves and go beyond their limits. Bakugo tossed a ball to Midoriya and asked how far he could throw a ball in middle school, and Midoriya caught it. Midoriya replied that he could throw about 72 meters. He never really thought it was a big deal to beat Kaken at that, but Kaken clearly had other ideas. Aizawa instructed Midoriya to try throwing with his quirk and to keep it as straight as possible. Midoriya thought to himself that keeping it straight might be the only thing he was bad at. Midoriya stood in the circle with his right leg in front of his left, lifted his right hand behind his head, and threw the ball while using the fire aspect of his quirk to propel it forward. Aizawa praised him and announced a distance of 3,982 meters, telling Midoriya to take that as an example. The next few tasks were easy. Midoriya never placed lower than 7th. He used his quirk to break the grip in the grip test, and in the 50-meter dash he used it to propel himself and finished only a hair behind Ida. The long jump was simple because he floated himself a little to clear the distance. Sidestepping was more complex because he kept switching the power from his feet to prevent them from overheating. For the endurance run he used the fire aspect of his quirk as a sort of booster. Upper body training didn't require his quirk at all. The only real problem was the seated toe touch. He had been focusing on strength more than flexibility, but since it was the last event he figured it would not matter too much. Overall he finished in 2nd place, losing only to Kaken, which did not bother him much given Kaken's state that morning. Aizawa called Midoriya over after the exercises. Midoriya was the first out of the locker room and wondered what he had done wrong since he had placed 2nd. Aizawa told him the matter was about his quirk and then led him into a classroom. Aizawa asked whether Midoriya had been pretending to be an anonymous hero. Midoriya began to explain that the person in question had been one of his childhood friends but was cut off. Aizawa accused Midoriya of lying, saying he had checked the records that stated Midoriya had been quirkless and demanded the whole truth under threat of expulsion. Midoriya admitted that he had been quirkless but that his quirk had returned during the sludge villain attack when he reached out for someone. He explained that he had gone to the doctor who turned out to be stealing quirks. Aizawa's face went pale when Midoriya mentioned the doctor. Aizawa then accused Midoriya of breaking the doctor's machine, noting that they had not found him on security cameras and had assumed the doctor had destroyed evidence. Aizawa demanded to know how Midoriya had managed it, speaking with a tone that felt like a command rather than a question. Midoriya explained that when he thought he was quirkless he tried to make himself useful as a sidekick by learning things like mapping villain hideouts and tampering with cameras to help his team get inside. He insisted that this was true. Part of him had believed he could become a hero by being prepared and resourceful. Aizawa remained skeptical and pressed for how he had obtained the password. Midoriya admitted that the doctor had left the computer on and that he had accessed it when no one was looking, unable to make it sound more noble. Aizawa's skepticism softened when he saw the genuine annoyance on Midoriya's face. Aizawa warned Midoriya that if any part of his story were shown to be false, he would be expelled, and then told him to go to lunch. Midoriya thanked Aizawa and said he had needed to talk to someone, which was true, and then left. Walking toward the lunch area, Midoriya was stopped by the purple-haired boy, who thanked him for giving him a spot in Class 1A. At that moment Midoriya asked whether Aizawa and the purple-haired boy were related. The boy turned around and fumbled for an explanation, then trailed off. Midoriya waved and suggested they be friends, addressing him as Shinso. The boy replied in a soft voice that sounded like a smile. Midoriya found he related to Shinso: wild hair, the look of someone who had not been sleeping well, and a guarded demeanor as if he had built walls around himself. Lost in thought again, Midoriya reached the lunch area and heard Kirishima call his name. Kirishima introduced Midoriya to Kaminari, Mina, and Shiro and explained each of their quirks. Kaminari could charge a phone, Mina was the biggest gossip who would know anything that happened, and Shiro was the one to go to when something needed taping. Midoriya was surprised that they were friendly with Kirishima rather than teasing him. Mina joked that Kirishima was so manly he would not date girls unless they were manly enough. Kirishima mentioned that he had invited someone to join them and warned the group about that person's blunt personality. Midoriya then noticed Katsuki approaching behind Kaminari and called out to him. Shiro began to ask who Katsuki was, but Katsuki grabbed him by the collar and warned that only Deku could call him Kaken and that anyone else who used that name would face serious consequences. Kaminari introduced Katsuki as Bakugo, and everyone in the group reacted with surprise and asked at once how Midoriya knew him. Kaken was so cool and brave. Izuku admired the way Kaken's quirk let him sweat a volatile substance from his hands and trigger powerful explosions. Kaken was guiding them through the forest. Kaken made a startled noise as he slipped off a log. Izuku screamed Kaken's name and reached out to grab him even though he knew Kaken was too far away. Then Kaken began to glow. Everyone turned to look at Izuku and he realized that his own hand was glowing. He concentrated and, to his surprise, his new quirk worked. He gently guided Kaken back onto the log. Kaken told Izuku that a telekinetic quirk was so cool, and Izuku felt a rush of pride to hear Kaken think that of him. Izuku admitted that it probably was cool. They spent the next few minutes playing around in the forest until it was time to go home. Izuku's mother remarked that he looked happy as she smiled. Izuku told her to guess what it was as she unlocked the door and took off her shoes. Izuku announced that he had gotten a quirk. His mother told him that it was wonderful and asked what it was. Izuku told her he would show her. He explained that his quirk required him to imagine someone floating. He closed his eyes, concentrated on the image of his mother suspended in the air, reached out his hand, and then opened his eyes. His mother reacted with amazement and then made dinner. A few hours later they went to bed. Time passed to the first year of middle school. Izuku acknowledged that while starting middle school SEGD, at least he still had Kaken and a few others. His quirk had grown stronger over the years. Now he was able to lift 2,000 pounds. Walking down the halls, he noticed an old classmate calling out and Kaken snapped at them to go away, flipping them off. Kaken turned to Izuku and asked why he was there, reminding Izuku that they were in the same class. Izuku began to ask Kaken why he had acted that way, but Kaken cut him off and said that most of the other students were unimportant extras with weak quirks. Kaken then asked what they should do after school. UA was less than 3 years away and he did not want to be weak. Izuku thought Kaken's words were harsh but admitted they were right that those people did not matter much. Izuku suggested a training schedule from Monday through Thursday with time to hang out on the weekends. Kaken agreed that they should do something like that and they debated what training to do. Then Izuku had an idea to clean up the beach. Kaken said that would be easy, and Izuku added that they should do it without using their quirks. Kaken pointed out that making things harder on themselves was what set them apart from the others, and then he opened the classroom door. Later, in their last year of middle school, Kaken swung an arm over Izuku's shoulder and greeted him. Izuku acknowledged the greeting and reflected that Deku had once been an insult before he gained his quirk, but now it was a nickname only Kaken could use. Kaken grew upset when others used it, and Izuku accepted that it was something only they shared. Kaken told Izuku that the UA admittance test was coming up and teased him about whether he was scared. Izuku replied that if anything, they should be worried about how jealous and angry people would be when they aced it, and he let a smirk show as they walked to class. Kaken asked about going to the arcade later, but Izuku said he had promised his mother he would cook dinner and offered to get coffee the next day instead. Kaken mused that if he had a mom like Izuku's he would treat her like royalty, and they entered the classroom. In class, Kaken loudly questioned whether everyone really wanted to be heroes, prompting the class to cheer. Kaken complained that only he and one other person had a real shot at getting into UA, which caused the rest of the class to react angrily. The teacher silently walked over to Izuku and told him that this would be the only time he would allow Izuku to use his quirk in class and asked him to quiet the students. The teacher likely trusted Izuku to keep Kaken in check. Izuku saw an opportunity to demonstrate that Kaken was right. He used his quirk to gently control the students' mouths all at once, except for Kaken, who continued to wear a superior grin. Then Izuku pressed his index finger and thumb together and shut off his quirk, causing the students to scramble back to their seats in startled silence. They were probably scared because the teacher had given Izuku permission to use his quirk. After school, Kaken said goodbye in a rough tone that almost sounded like the farewell of a close friend. Izuku returned the sentiment playfully, calling Kaken by a mocking nickname. As Izuku walked home he remembered everything he and Kaken had done for each other. He had taught Kaken not to underestimate opponents and to be somewhat kinder. Kaken had taught Izuku to have thicker skin and how to be more forceful when necessary. Their work cleaning the beach had built muscle for both of them. Izuku's body had become stronger, and he could now lift 10 tons, and Kaken's explosions had grown far more powerful from their training. Suddenly Izuku felt something like sludge trying to enter his body. The presence told him not to struggle as it tried to take over. Izuku refused to let it win and thought that no one should use another person as a shield. He shouted for it to stop and, when the intruder's hold loosened slightly, he used his quirk to pull them apart. The presence demanded to know what he was doing. I looked around for something to use and noticed an empty bottle on the ground. I used my quirk to trap the sludge villain inside. All Might began to give his catchphrase but stopped when he saw me spinning the bottle on the tip of my finger. He looked surprised, then composed himself. All Might asked for my name. I told him my name was Midoriya Izuku and asked if I could take a picture. All Might agreed, and we took a photo before waving goodbye. I reminded myself there was somewhere I needed to be. I sprinted home as fast as I could and made it to the door. I apologized for being late. My mother said it was fine and asked me to help get ready because the Bakugos were coming over for dinner. Later, as we sat with friends, someone recalled that Kaken had been my best friend in kindergarten, that our mothers were friends, and that we had always been in school together. Bakugo shoved into my face and demanded to know if I remembered his first kiss. He was up in my face. I guess this was payback from earlier. Kaminari looked like he was about to interject. I explained that Bakugo's explosive personality usually drove people away, and it would be surprising if he had kissed anyone. Bakugo scowled and charged up his fists. He slammed his fist into the wall beside us in a sudden, anime-style outburst. Since using quirks was fair game, I used a quick maneuver to deflect his hands. My palm lit up with energy. I described Bakugo's quirk, explaining that he could produce an explosive substance that reacted when he used it, which was why he sometimes smelled different. Bakugo's face flushed from the attention. Mina chimed in and joked about smelling caramel when he arrived, which only made Bakugo yell louder. A friend told Bakugo to be polite because these were not no-name extras, and then Bakugo asked to speak to me privately. I followed him, and he made a dark, joking warning that if I went missing or got hurt the next day, people would know who to blame. He quickly snapped that he was not going to harm me. Before I could ask what he wanted to talk about, Bakugo suddenly stepped closer and pressed his forehead against mine in an impulsive, intense gesture. We both stood there stunned. When I asked what he wanted to discuss, Bakugo scoffed and accused me of behaving inconsistently, one moment a cute nerd, the next acting like an edgelord. I realized he had just called me cute and blushed inwardly while he denied it loudly. He went on to say he didn't need my help that day and accused me of lying to him all these years. He slammed his fist again into the wall beside us in frustration. I argued back. trying to point out how ridiculous his assumptions were after 11 years of me following him and admiring him from afar. My voice started to break and I felt like crying. Bakugo cut me off, asking why I had saved him and accused me of always looking down on him. I looked at him and laughed weakly at how oblivious he seemed. He started to say my name, and I forced myself to be blunt. I told Bakugo how oblivious he had been. I had done nothing but admire him and follow him for 11 years. I had finally backed off, stopped calling him the nickname he obviously hated, and left him alone, and yet he still acted like I had betrayed him. I screamed that I had admired him all along. I felt like I might cry again. Bakugo yelled that he didn't know what he wanted and begged that they just pretend the argument hadn't happened. I nodded. I thanked him for showing me that somewhere deep down a part of the old me still existed. He tried to respond in his usual tsundere way, but I said I would take care of that part myself. His face went dark, hurt as if his hopes had been crushed. I started to walk back to the cafeteria, wiping away almost dry tears, when Bakugo came up behind me and hugged me. He shouted that he was jealous, voice breaking. I turned to see his face wet with tears. Bakugo explained that he had been jealous of everything about me the way everyone liked me, my early hero instincts since I was 4 when I tried to help him out of the river. He admitted that even though he had a quirk and I didn't, he feared I might become a better hero than him. To cope with that jealousy, he had pushed people away from me and tried to crush my ambitions. He apologized for telling me to hurt myself and for making everyone hate me. He said he didn't expect forgiveness and didn't want it, he wanted this as punishment. The past 10 months had shown him he had been awful, and he felt he deserved whatever came his way. I started to respond, but he stopped me and, kneeling with tears, said he wasn't done. He declared he was going to quit UA as his punishment. Izuku tried to finish his sentence, saying that this way they would never have to see each other again, but Katsuki slapped him and immediately told him not to give him that sad smile. Katsuki told Izuku that he did not want this, that this was not the real him, and that he wanted his victory fair and square. He said he might not be ready to forgive Izuku yet, but if Izuku left UA he would be dead to him. Izuku looked at Katsuki's face and saw his right cheek blush bright pink. Katsuki strained to get Izuku's name out. Katsuki declared that they were going plus ultra and that he did not care if Izuku hated him. He told Izuku to try to be a better hero than him and that would be his punishment. Katsuki did not even notice that he had started to cry. Izuku promised that he would change and jumped up to hug Katsuki. Izuku had thought the only time Katsuki would hug him was under extreme circumstances. Katsuki wiped his tears and gave Izuku a genuine smile. He admitted it would take a long time for him to change and that he might still speak harshly about their classmates sometimes. Izuku laughed softly and said that this was exactly what he would expect from Katsuki, his childhood best friend. Katsuki asked Izuku to start over as friends and suggested they drop the nicknames. Izuku refused to let him stop calling him by his hero name, and Katsuki insisted on keeping his own nickname as well. They both decided to keep using their names. Izuku hugged Katsuki so hard they fell down. Katsuki thanked Izuku for showing him that a part of him still cared. Later, Izuku heard someone fall over and recognized Mina. He checked on her, and Mina said she was fine as she took his hand to stand and rubbed the top of her head. Mina announced that if she was here, the others should come out, and some classmates teased her for blowing their cover. Mina explained that she wanted to get close to her favorite pairing, but when she began to define the term, Katsuki cut her off. Katsuki called Mina pink face, and Mina screamed in mock indignation. Another classmate pointed out that Mina should feel lucky, that was the nicest thing Katsuki had called someone on the first try, and they laughed, though Katsuki and Izuku did not join in. One of the students said that Katsuki was right, and everyone fell silent. Izuku suggested they go back and have lunch, and he skipped through the hallways with the others. Shiro commented on how Katsuki had gone from an intimidating bad boy to peppy and soft in a short span of time. When a phone rang, Izuku told Katsuki that he had made him miss lunch, and Katsuki immediately apologized, stumbling over his words. Izuku reassured him that it was fine, and they all walked to class. Katsuki warned someone not to call him that again, threatening them in his usual blunt way. In class, Izuku tilted his chair back and rested his head upside down while someone asked what Hitoshi Shinso was reading. Shinso answered that he was reading To Kill a Mockingbird. Another student said he had read it before and remembered being sad when Tom Robinson died, and he appreciated how far society had come. Shinso explained that this edition focused on people without quirks and criticized the way it portrayed them as objects of pity rather than equals. He called that social hierarchy ridiculous. Izuku asked Shinso about his quirk, and Shinso admitted, with some shame, that his power was brainwashing. Izuku told him that the quirk was impressive and that someone like Shinso could inspire people with more villain-like quirks. He said breaking the traditional mold would make Shinso popular. Shinso looked up and gave Izuku a genuine smile, the kind Izuku remembered having himself. Izuku noticed Katsuki silently fuming and walked over to him to give him a hug, which made Katsuki blush bright red. Izuku assured Katsuki that no one was going to take him away. At that moment All Might burst through the door, announcing that Aizawa had forgotten to mention an early half-PRD lunch for maximum efficiency, and excited chatter filled the room. The man who had once crushed his dreams was in the room, and Izuku Midoriya set his jaw with determination to become the best hero he could. All Might introduced himself as the practical battle instructor and announced an indoor heroes versus villains exercise. He instructed everyone to change into their costumes and meet at the training grounds. Izuku remembered revising his old outfit to remove the All Might-style hair. The new design featured a visor with silver metal chains that connected at the back and a sharper-looking respirator. He had done the welding himself. Uraraka admired Izuku's costume and called it scary but cool. Kirishima complimented that it made him look more manly. Uraraka asked whether the support team had made the suit. Izuku replied that he had made it himself and explained that, wanting to gain as many skills as possible, he had taken up basic welding. As they walked to the training grounds, Izuku noticed Katsuki Bakugo's outfit and moved away from Uraraka, who gave a pouty look. Izuku asked Bakugo what the barrels on his costume did. Bakugo ruffled his hair and smirked, teasing that a little nerd like him would like it and refusing to reveal the details. All Might stood beside two boxes and explained that the teams would be picked randomly to keep things fair. He pulled two cards and announced that Izuku Midoriya and Katsuki Bakugo were paired together as Team A. The two exchanged confident looks. The rest of the class looked uneasy, with the exception of Todoroki. Siro reminded the room that those two had the highest practical exam scores, and Bakugo added that they also topped the written exam. All Might defended the fairness of the draw and explained that the first card drawn would be the heroes and the second the villains. He then announced the team assignments. Team D would be the heroes Uraraka and Ida, and Team A would be the villains. He explained the use of capture tape and the mock bomb and emphasized that they would also need to act the part. Bakugo leaned in at the end of the briefing and, with characteristic intensity, told Izuku they were going to beat their opponents. Later, Bakugo and Izuku stood next to the mock bomb and discussed strategy. Bakugo suggested he could handle the opponents alone. Izuku reminded him that there would be people stronger than expected and that this exercise was for training rather than a test of stamina. He proposed a plan. Bakugo should try a sneak attack on Ida when he was with Uraraka on a floor where everything was connected so that breakages could be turned to their advantage, and then Bakugo could improvise the rest. Bakugo complained that it sounded too easy. Izuku suggested trying part of it without using Bakugo's quirk. Bakugo ignited briefly but then deliberately turned his quirk off, accepting the challenge. Izuku stopped himself from going too far with the roleplay and instead reminded Bakugo to incapacitate their targets convincingly. Bakugo's expression hardened as he adopted his villainous role, not because he was good at acting but because he could convincingly portray ruthless determination. From Bakugo's perspective, he noted how convincing Izuku's acting could be as he moved through the hallways searching for the heroes. A teammate reported to him through the ear intercom that Ida had been located but Uraraka had slipped away and was heading toward Izuku. Bakugo snapped at the teammate for the mistake and ordered proof of capture, hoping Izuku was as committed to the performance as the rest of them. Bakugo rounded a corner and realized someone had moved behind him. He braced himself and used a quick physics-based maneuver to grab the attacker's arm and fling him into the wall. The opponent hit the floor hard, and Bakugo reminded him that he was playing a villain and that mercy was not part of the role. The nearby heroes protested that Bakugo was taking things too far and insisted they would defeat him. A teammate then reported that Uraraka was directly below Bakugo's position and suggested he use the new concussive devices in his gauntlets. Bakugo raised his gauntlet toward the ceiling, preparing for the next move. Ida shouted a warning that she would be in danger, but it was already too late. A villain over the intercom taunted Midoriya about his face while trying to keep control of the situation. From where the students were positioned, the explosion had looked small. Uraraka had dodged it but collided with a pillar and was hurt. The villain used a quirk to stabilize her so she could recover faster. All Might announced over the loudspeakers that the villains had won the exercise. Midoriya dropped down holding Uraraka, who was clearly injured. He moved quickly and handed her to Recovery Girl while the others corralled the captured students. Ida remained frozen in shock and had to be secured so he would not move. In the evaluation room, All Might asked for an explanation of the match and how a fire-type quirk appeared in the exchange. Midoriya explained that Uraraka had dodged the blast but struck the pillar. He had used his quirk to help her recover. He added that a family trait in his lineage sometimes produced a small flame and that he'd used it to an advantage. Later, in Midoriya's own thoughts, he remembered the earlier chaos. A teammate had reported finding Ida while Uraraka had escaped toward Midoriya's position. Midoriya admitted that he had been filling the role of the lead villain for the exercise. He felt torn between being harsh and being forgiving when giving orders, and he told an underling to bring proof of capture so the mistake could be rectified rather than issuing an extreme threat. Midoriya had felt the building tremble as Bakugo and Ida fought below, and he had been able to locate Ida by the pattern of footsteps. That advantage, combined with the earlier crash, had forced Uraraka out of her hiding place. Even though it would have been easy to finish the simulation quickly, Midoriya kept up the act of toying with his opponents. He had to commit to the role. He mocked the chosen hiding spot over the intercom and dared the heroes to act. When a skirmish broke out, he landed a non-graphic blow that knocked Uraraka back and made her clutch her arm. He acknowledged afterward that he had struck harder than intended and planned to apologize later. Then he used the intercom again to draw Bakugo's attention, suggesting that Bakugo use his new tactics at the exact moment Uraraka would pass beneath him. Uraraka, attempting to react, bumped her head and was briefly dazed, giving the villains the appearance of victory. Back in the evaluation room, a student with a large ponytail, Momo, offered her analysis. She said that Uraraka and Ida had relied on predictable strategies and that one-on-one tactics were insufficient. Bakugo had reacted to Midoriya's maneuvers and only locked into character at the final moment. Midoriya had been recognized for quickly adapting to the role of villain even while maintaining the heart of a hero. All Might explained that Midoriya had earned points not because he played a villain but because he had saved Uraraka during the practical exam and had shown dedication and presence of mind even while acting against his friends. The class absorbed the guidance and settled into a quieter determination. Midoriya steadied his voice and encouraged everyone to do their best, finishing with the class motto. The students paused for a heartbeat and then shouted the rallying cry together. A short time later, Midoriya was walking to school and found a crowd of reporters gathered at the gate. The reporters jostled and hurled insults about the recent exercise, and Bakugo wore a look of disgust at being associated with the mess. Aizawa moved to disperse the media and to excuse the students' absences, but Midoriya and Bakugo slipped away. Midoriya grabbed Bakugo's arm and helped him over the wall without using his quirk. He wanted to keep some aspects of his ability private to preserve an advantage. Midoriya teased Bakugo about showing off, and they exchanged a few awkward words. Midoriya reminded Bakugo that popularity and perception were part of being a hero and that it was up to them how they handled the embarrassment. He told Bakugo that he valued their friendship and did not want it to change, grabbing Bakugo's collar in a light, firm gesture and asking him not to take that away. They continued toward class talking about small, everyday things, and when Bakugo laughed it made Midoriya smile. They entered the classroom together, Bakugo took his seat, and Midoriya glanced over at Uraraka, who had recovered enough to be present. The morning moved on with the usual routines, the lessons learned from the practical exam already settling into the students' minds. She had a small bruise on her forehead. He apologized and gave her an apologetic bow. She looked confused for a moment and forgave him on the condition that he buy her an ice cream. He agreed and she smiled. Bakugo noticed the discomfort on his face and stood up, teasing that the narrator could buy the ice cream while reminding him that he had promised to eat lunch with him. Bakugo put his hand on the narrator's head and complained about broken promises. The narrator told him it was fine and that they could have lunch next week. He reminded himself he was supposed to be her admirer and promised to play the part. Achiko giggled and blushed, and Bakugo pulled the narrator away. Bakugo accused the narrator of suddenly becoming a flirt. The narrator protested, then explained that if he made more friends, his chances of finding a partner would improve. Bakugo teased that he did like her, and the narrator punched him in the shoulder. Bakugo laughed and said the narrator would be his partner for life. The narrator thought Bakugo was unexpectedly endearing when he giggled. Mina screamed that she hoped the relationship was happening, and Bakugo shouted at her to stay out of it. Mr. Izawa stepped out of his sleeping bag and told the class to settle down, announcing that they would be choosing a class representative. The class cheered at the return to something ordinary. Ida asked if the selection would be a democratic vote, and Izawa confirmed that it would. Ida worried aloud that everyone would vote for themselves, and Izawa told them to believe in their classmates. The narrator voted for Ida, trusting his sense of fairness, but he was surprised when the votes added up to 13 and he was named class president with Momo as vice president. Ida sulked in the corner before composing himself. Izawa remarked that Midoriya and Momo were logical choices given their skills and assets, and then dismissed the class until after lunch before retreating back into his cocoon. They walked to the cafeteria and the narrator met up with Uraraka and Ida. Uraraka leaned on his shoulder in a friendly way, and he gently scolded her for behaving like that in school. Someone asked what she was doing. Uraraka blushed and waved her arms, insisting it was nothing and saying she wanted a banana split. He bought one during the lunch rush and handed it to her. He told his friends he had to go see Bakugo. Bakugo said he would not mind if the narrator was a little late and then started to insist the narrator come along, but an alarm interrupted them, ordering all UA students to evacuate the school. People shouted as chaos spread. Bakugo and the narrator separated and ran in different directions. The narrator told Ida to manage the evacuation and, feeling the responsibility of the newly won position, declared that Ida would serve as class representative for the moment. He lifted Ida to emphasize that everyone should evacuate in a calm and orderly fashion. The students formed a line and exited the school. After nearly an hour outside, Principal Nizu announced over a speaker that the disturbance had been only reporters and instructed them to finish the last part of their lunch and proceed with the regular schedule. They returned inside, and the narrator noticed that the UA barrier had been damaged, its surface fractured and useless. A fragment of a memory surfaced. A scratchy voice on the other end of a phone had yelled about their most powerful quirk being dropped and warned that, if not for someone's quick action, the speaker would have destroyed the person responsible. The voice sounded hoarse, as if it had not spoken in a long time. Todoroki asked what had happened, and the narrator said he had to find Izawa. Todoroki reached out to grab him and missed. The narrator ran to where Izawa was speaking with all might and interrupted, insisting that what he had learned was important. All Might began to brush him off, but Izawa cut the conversation short and told All Might they would finish it later, taking the narrator's concerns seriously. All Might asked if he had seen the narrator somewhere before. The narrator replied that he had. Izawa asked why he had pulled him away from All Might. The narrator explained that he thought he knew who had broken the barrier, recalling the line from the phone conversation about a dropped powerful quirk and a narrow escape. Izawa grew more serious and warned him not to tell anyone else. Then Izawa asked if he had ever heard of the League of Villains. The narrator answered that it was the group responsible for All Might's decline, and Izawa regarded him with a troubled expression. I said that I might have heard of them. The teacher asked how I knew about that and grabbed my shoulders. I stepped back and let his arms fall to his sides. I explained that when the sludge villain attacked I had been its first victim, and that All Might had saved me. All Might had run out of time, had explained everything to a random stranger, and had told me that I couldn't become a hero. The teacher reacted with shock and said he would have a talk with All Might. He pinched the bridge of his nose and asked Midoriya if I was positively sure they had said that word for word. I confirmed. He told me to repeat what they had said. I did, their most powerful quirk. The teacher cut me off and asked why my voice sounded so scratchy. I admitted that that was what the voice had sounded like. The teacher said he would keep that in mind. He warned Midoriya not to use the quirk if he ever encountered anyone from that group unless it was absolutely necessary or the opponent was low level. It was unlikely that anyone would believe them otherwise. He asked if I understood, and I said yes. He dismissed me with a remark that my boyfriend was probably waiting, and then, to my surprise, complimented me for stepping down as something mature. He told me I was going to be a great hero and called for all might, saying they needed to have a talk. I ran up to Kaken and hugged him from behind. He yelped, turned around and recognized me. He told me that Round Face had said I wanted Sonic to be class rep as we left the school. I said that she had done what I had asked. Kaken snapped that this was my chance to get noticed and that I was throwing it away. I responded that, unlike Ida, I didn't need help to be noticed. Kaken admitted I had changed in the past few months, and I said the same of him, adding that he now had a real friend instead of a nameless extra following him. I noticed one of the extras Kaken hung out with a black-haired guy who smoked and pointed him out. The man looked over and walked toward us, mocking Kaken and asking what he was doing with me, the quirkless runt. The man listed all of my accomplishments: highest scorer on the entrance exams, highest on the practical exams, intervening in a dangerous situation, and possessing telekinetic abilities, and sneered that I was a poor joke. Kaken said they should ignore me and walked away. The man demanded answers about my quirk, insulting my intelligence. As he reached for my shoulder, I grabbed his arm and flipped him over my shoulder. He hit the ground and struggled, coughing. I kicked to send him stumbling into the wall. Kaken taunted him that he wouldn't get into UA, and I laughed at the idea. The man threatened severe retaliation and Kaken stared at me, bewildered. Kaken then scolded the man for how he could expect to save anyone. At least the person he was defending had a quirk, and Kaken accused me of never having the heart to change things. I replied that the other person had not truly changed either. Kaken said some people only say they changed while others actually change, and that was what made me different. He urged me to come with him. We walked away, not knowing whom we had just confronted. The man was a low-level member of the League of Villains at that point, soon to be more dangerous. A woman nearby reported back that they should tell Shigaraki his hunch was wrong. The guy was strictly fire-type and had potential for the League because of how he had reacted to being kicked and threatened. Unbeknownst to her, a man had been listening to the entire exchange. Words like quirkless runt, intervening in a dangerous situation, you never had the heart, and some people actually change echoed in his mind. He had been watching me for a while and would not forget me. Those words meant something important to him, important enough that they would influence his decisions later. He would spare a pro-hero and the hero's young companion for reasons of his own. He did not agree with killing false heroes. Instead, he wanted to set an example and make people change. He wanted recognition as the greatest hero of all time. He wanted to inspire people, to tell them that if they worked hard enough they could do anything they set their minds to. That was why he had been paying attention. Later, Kaken admitted that my reaction had been a bit extreme even for him. He said the man had felt wrong. It was strange that he had stepped up for Kaken as if Kaken had been an accessory, counting on the bully not to be hit. Kaken worried about switching personalities and said he didn't want me to take on his level of anger issues. He laughed, then stopped and looked down, asking what was wrong. I remembered when Kaken had once spoken aloud what looked like a suicide note as a stunt. I told him I had told him to stop instead of getting him help, and I said I had felt terrible about that. Kaken insisted the note had been fake, intended as a way to stop people from telling him to hurt himself. He admitted he had also wanted to see if I would care. I said I was sorry. If we had been younger, he would have never even thought of tricking me. Bakugo accused that Izuku had made him hate him that much, yet he was still friends with him. Izuku hugged Bakugo and insisted that he wanted them to be friends, begging him to stop and let them have that. Bakugo asked what friends even did. Izuku answered that Ida and Uraraka had tried to invite him to the movies a few days ago. Bakugo responded with a curt suggestion of movies, and Izuku asked what kinds of films he liked. Bakugo admitted to liking horror. Izuku teased that Bakugo's tough face made him look out of place in fluffy roles. Bakugo brushed it off, and when Izuku said he thought Bakugo liked hero movies, Bakugo sighed and said he hated them. Bakugo explained that All Might had crushed his dreams before he even discovered his quirk, back on the day of the sludge villain incident, and that he still held onto some resentment. Izuku was surprised that Bakugo had been told that, and Bakugo recalled that it had happened half an hour before he found out about his quirk. When Izuku asked how Bakugo had gotten his quirk back, Bakugo deflected, saying he did not know and maybe he was a late bloomer. Izuku joked that if he hadn't had such a clouded ego, he might have corrupted Izuku's mind. Izuku replied that Bakugo spoke as if Izuku's mind weren't already influenced. They reached the theater and Bakugo announced they were there. When Izuku asked what to watch, Bakugo said something with lots of stabbing because his life had been too mushy lately, and Izuku laughed and protested that he wanted his nerd back from the imposter. Bakugo teased and pushed, and Izuku wrapped his arms around Bakugo's waist, pleading for him not to be mean. Bakugo flushed and tried to push him off, accusing Izuku of doing it on purpose and of messing with him. Izuku answered that he might be easy to read. Bakugo snapped that Izuku was trying to get in his pants. The crude phrase was softened into Bakugo accusing him of getting too close in a way that made him uncomfortable. Izuku teased back unpredictably, but Bakugo grew exasperated and stormed off to buy tickets after a heated exchange. Inside the theater, Bakugo kept up a running, gruff commentary about letting him pay until Izuku finally gave in. Izuku checked reviews online and found the movie described as terrifying, which felt like a perfect excuse to be close to Bakugo. The film turned out to be an adaptation of a video game. It did not scare Izuku much, but Bakugo flinched slightly when Izuku instinctively reached to hug him during tense moments. Izuku thought he heard something like scratching and a whisper from the man in front of them, a voice that sounded oddly familiar, but otherwise the screening passed without incident. When the lights came up and they prepared to leave, Izuku heard a clink from the seat in front and reached over to pick up an object. The person in front was already gone. The object in Izuku's hand turned out to be a signal jammer. He stared at it, puzzled by why someone would have such a device on hand, and tucked it into his pocket to study later. Bakugo caught him mumbling and teased him about it, then shifted to an awkward question about whether this was a date. Izuku declared it a date in a teasing tone, which meant Bakugo had to escort him back to his residence. Bakugo made a snide remark about how Izuku's charm came across, and Izuku turned bright red and covered his face with his sleeve. Bakugo retorted that Izuku was embarrassing him in return. They locked arms and Bakugo walked Izuku home. Izuku knocked and opened the door to a very worried mother. She asked where he had been and expressed how worried she had been. Izuku answered that he had watched a movie with Bakugo. Bakugo offered a greeting to Izuku's aunt, and the family exchanged brief, somewhat awkward pleasantries. Bakugo declined an invitation to come inside because he hadn't told his own mother where he was and preferred not to get in trouble. He said his goodbyes and jogged home. Izuku's mother handed him a plate of California rolls, and he enjoyed the crab. At the dinner table, Izuku's mother made an awkward comment about relationships that he quickly brushed off. Embarrassed, he excused himself to go to bed, thanking her for the food as he climbed the stairs. Before he left, his mother told him quietly that she was extremely proud of him. Later, the students were told to put on their hero costumes for rescue training at USJ. They boarded the bus and Izuku sat next to Bakugo. He was still distracted by the jammer in his pocket when Kaminari teased Bakugo about his personality. Izuku slipped the jammer back into his pocket and silence fell for a moment. Kaminari asked if something was wrong with Bakugo, and someone else explained that Bakugo was just trying to be nicer and warned not to push his buttons because he might explode. Bakugo then hung his head out the window and shouted angrily for a while, and the outburst left him exhausted and knocked out. Todoroki wondered how Izuku could stand someone like Bakugo. Izuku explained that they were childhood friends and that there were many things he knew about Bakugo that Bakugo did not even realize about himself. The bus arrived. The instructor warned everyone to wake Bakugo and to try not to let him blow up the bus, and the students began to step off and move toward the training area. I poked him a few times and called his name, but he still did not wake. I tried a different approach and taunted that Deku was a freckled, green-headed loser. Bakugo shot upright immediately. We were already at our stop when we stepped off the bus. Pro Hero 13 introduced herself and explained that she would give us a tour of USJ before overseeing the rescue training. She announced the different survival scenarios we might encounter, including fires, ships sinking, poison leaks, and extreme weather, then told us to observe the disaster simulations without entering them. She assigned everyone a partner and said she would be taking a nap while watching for anything interesting, directing a pointed look at Bakugo. Bakugo sat with his mouth open, uncharacteristically quiet. Given his reputation, retaliation would have been expected, but his respect for teachers and heroes kept him silent. 13 continued with the instructions and asked if anyone wanted to pair up. She gave me a playful, flirtatious look as she suggested that partnering with me would be like a date. Ida politely excused himself, and Bakugo interrupted, insisting that the nerd stick with him because he had things to explain after class. Ida hesitated and then offered to go to the landslide zone, mentioning that it suited his quirk, and he reached for my hand. Bakugo mocked the idea of it being a date but agreed to play along when I teased back. Our classmates passed greetings as we wandered, mostly ignored by Bakugo's grunts. We returned to the meetup point where 13 was ready to explain the rules again. Elsewhere, Shigaraki fretted and apologized, saying he deserved punishment for a failure and fearing disappointment. An older voice reassured him, saying that making mistakes was part of learning to lead and that disappointment would not be the response. Shigaraki insisted on proceeding with their plan to activate jammers and prepare a Nomo for an attack on USJ, aware that using the locator would trigger the jammer and alert others minutes in advance. Another voice told him to take a look at something surprising that had appeared. Back at USJ, 13 observed a blinking device and questioned the source. I told Aizawa that I had found an advanced jammer the previous day and that it had started blinking, which could mean it was about to activate. A cloud of dark smoke appeared on the lower level, revealing intruders manifesting as a smoke figure, a being covered in hands, and a bird-like creature with exposed brain-like features. I explained that I had blocked a signal and that the League of Villains had infiltrated the school. Aizawa told me to remember the precautions he had given and asked me to protect everyone without using quirk unnecessarily against high-level opponents. He assigned Shinso to help take control of the bird-like intruder. Ida was sent to run back to UA to inform them of the villain attack. As he began to run, purple smoke surrounded us, and Kurojairi identified himself as a member of the League of Villains and declared hostile intent. 13 ordered the children behind her and prepared to act, using a defensive move to draw attention. Suddenly, Bakugo and Kirishima began to move in a way that suggested they were being transported. I grabbed Bakugo's arm and yelled, but it was too late. We were pulled to another location. I demanded to know what they had been thinking. Bakugo started to intimidate the intruders with a fierce display. I used my quirk to create controlled flames that flared up around the intruders, careful to keep the effects non-lethal and focused on forcing them back. The flames stunned and shook them, and they scrambled away to the corner, shaken and disoriented. The fear of the sudden attack caused some of them to collapse briefly. I had been strategic, relying on the knowledge that none of us would suffer fatal harm in this encounter. Bakugo warned them that further interruption would have consequences and threatened them in harsh terms, his tone enough to make the villains visibly nervous. One of the intruders admitted that he had tried to handle the situation alone and then braced himself, activating his hardening quirk defensively. I sighed. I asked if everyone was ready and pointed at Bakugo, who stared blankly as if a computer were rebooting. I snapped my fingers in front of his face to get his attention. Bakugo apologized and begged not to be killed, admitting he had been wrong, and pleaded to be spared. I groaned and warned that if one of us died it would be their fault, then reminded everyone we had to reach the bird-shaped enemy. Kirishima questioned whether Midoriya had a plan, and I told him I did and corrected him that it was Izuku to him. Kirishima asked if that was my first name, and I pushed him back a step until he yelled that Izuku was fine. I started walking down the building, but Bakugo and Kirishima froze. I asked if they were coming, and they immediately began running down the stairs, which was easier than I expected. A barely conscious villain member staggered over and suggested we could stay hidden and avoid fighting. I answered that I had to make sure my friends didn't die and that hiding would not make me a hero. The man chuckled and urged me to stay a real hero and inspire others not to become like them, warning that even if I felt remorse there would be no going back. He fainted, and I rushed down the stairs to catch up to Bakugo and Kirishima. I asked what the man wanted to talk about. Kirishima said the man had suggested staying hidden. Bakugo scoffed that hiding would be unmanly. When we reached the area, Mr. Izawa was badly injured and struggling. I refused to let the one good hero I knew fall like that and resolved to keep him from going down without a fight. I ran at the bird-like enemy and targeted its arms, blasting them until they were useless and grabbing Izawa in the process. The creature called me a troublesome kid and warned that bosses couldn't be beaten so easily. I responded that I understood, and tried to disable it further, but its regeneration was too fast. The villain mocked my reference to a game. I snapped that I liked the game too, which made me rue having similar tastes to some villains. The creature caught me. Someone asked what to do with me now, and another voice suggested taking me as a prize for beating the level. I found myself oddly admiring the villain's game-like outlook on everything. Shinso commanded with a voice that sounded like someone else, and the creature immediately dropped me. I scrambled to grab Izawa. Shinso was using a voice modulator to mimic another voice. Bakugo and Kirishima were told to jump the creature, and Bakugo leapt, placing his hand on the metal surface of the portal-like fabric that surrounded the area. Bakugo threatened them to make one wrong move and he'd take them out, and I remarked that it did not sound very heroic. Just then Todoroki arrived and froze the bird-shaped enemy with a precise icy blast, possibly uncertain how the battle would resolve with multiple voices controlling things. I thought the fight might be over. The villains called out and then vanished into the purple fog of the portal. I grabbed Izawa and slung him over my shoulder. The creature had been left behind, but as Todoroki unfroze it, Shinso took control and guided it back. I noticed an exposed core on the creature that had to be its weak point. Tsu had outsmarted some water-based quirks by convincing others she was on a boat, which impressed me. Uraraka reacted with relief at first and then recoiled in shock at the creature. I muttered, half joking, that if the creature turned out not to be human it could be my new pet, but then I stopped myself and tried to calm down. Bakugo covered my mouth with his hand and told me not to take it personally. He said I was just upset because the villains had escaped. I pulled his hand away and protested that the villains had been right there and I had almost caught them. Someone warned me to be careful, saying that my Bakugo was showing. Bakugo told Kirishima to shut up, and Kirishima snapped back. Bakugo was forbidden from hanging out with me the next day, and Kirishima was told the same. Then Bakugo suddenly realized I was gone and guessed I had gone to find the villains and give them a piece of my mind. Shinso settled the creature down and had it sit. I explained that I had actually been fixing up 13. I had always had a knack for sewing and could make things hold together and look neat, even if I was not a professional. All Might then appeared, announcing his presence, and I acknowledged that he had arrived. Ida informed everyone that he had been told 10 minutes earlier about a group of villains attacking USJ and asked where they were now. Shinso cut in and credited Midoriya with devising a plan to take down the League of Villains, saving Mr. Izawa, and helping capture a creature referred to as a Nomu. The others nodded in agreement. All Might began to praise me, but I interrupted and emphasized that it had been a team effort. Bakugo and Kirishima had kept one of the most dangerous villains in check. Todoroki and Shinso had handled precautions with the Nomu, Ida had gone to get help, and the rest had distracted other members. I had saved Izawa, but it had taken everyone working together, and I warned them not to try to take all the credit. All Might attempted to insist on praising me again, but I cut him off once more and questioned what he had been doing earlier, since Ida had arrived well before him. I already knew the answer. Earlier that day All Might had spent hours fighting lower-level crimes, apparently for fame and glory. Mr. Izawa tried to get up, seeking to understand what was happening. While Izuku was fixing Izawa's elbow, he added some antibiotics from a pocket and cleaned it with Izawa's own bandages. The wound was still raw, so movement would hurt. Izuku was glad he had arrived when he did. Repairing Izawa's jaw would have been a nightmare. Izawa groaned in pain, and Izuku told him that he needed to lie down because the wound was still fresh. Izawa brushed it off and said a little pain never killed anyone, and Izuku replied that he was actually worried Izawa's arm might suffer more damage. Another hero offered to keep Izawa still, promising to harden his arms if necessary. Bakugo came up behind Izuku and whispered that he hoped Izuku did not record his hero notes in the way he joked about. Izuku pushed him away and explained his suspicion that the attacker was at least partly human. A few other heroes arrived, and Midnight reported that Nizu had warned them about an attack at USJ. She reacted with shock at the creature they encountered. Izuku explained that the thing did not seem fully human. He described that it reacted to burns much like a human would, showed exposed tissue and injury but nothing grotesque, and had signs of a head injury that made it unresponsive except when given commands. It appeared to understand speech but could not respond on its own, suggesting it had been put under someone else's control. When another hero asked if it might simply be an animal, Izuku answered with a wry remark about clothes and everyone stared for a moment. Izuku admitted that his hands were charred from using his quirk and said he felt faint. He passed out and Bakugo caught him. Later he learned that strong emotions soon after using his quirk could cause burns to his skin. When Izuku woke up, he was surrounded by classmates and teachers. Recovery Girl had treated his arms. He asked how long he had been out and whether Aizawa was all right. Bakugo smacked him lightly on the head and scolded him for always putting others before himself, insisting that Izuku needed to rest. Aizawa assured Izuku that he was fine and asked to speak with him privately the next day, then added that a reporter had filmed the whole incident, so it could not be kept private. Izuku told them it was understandable, given the circumstances, and that if some heroes had not rushed into things on their own it might have been easier. Bakugo had made the others apologize for 2 hours while using aggressive threats, Izuku said, and they all reacted to that with varying degrees of embarrassment. Bakugo muttered that such threats were not acceptable and that violence was wrong. When someone teased Bakugo about who had hurt him, Bakugo answered tersely and tried to leave, and Izuku attempted to stand but found his legs weak and had to steady himself on the bed. Momo offered to help with some exercises, but Izuku declined, saying he would be fine and that Bakugo could take him home as part of his punishment. Kirishima and others argued lightly over who should carry Izuku's bag, and Kiri was defended as not being a repeat offender. Bakugo put Izuku's arm over his shoulder and helped him up, declaring that the nerd was in good, for now non-explosive, hands. Bakugo helped until Izuku could walk on his own again, teasing him about returning Izuku's bag only at Bakugo's house. Izuku insisted it had been a team effort. Bakugo mocked Izuku's humility, and when Izuku refused to give Bakugo the outrageous brag Bakugo demanded, Bakugo blurted out a clumsy compliment that made Izuku very red. Bakugo quickly changed the subject, dropped Izuku's bag, and ran off. Later, as Izuku approached the school, a group of reporters crowded around him, asking about the rescue and the villains. Izuku felt overwhelmed until a young man stepped between Izuku and the reporters, calling out that it was rude to bombard someone who had just saved so many people. The man grabbed Izuku's hand and ran with him into the school, introducing himself as Monoma, the class representative of Class 1B, and complimenting Izuku on his role in stopping a feared criminal group. Izuku insisted once more that it had been a team effort. I had almost never received praise from my peers, and now that I was getting it I did not know what to do with it. Kendo observed that I must be one of the better students from the hero course. I stammered a thank you. Kendo went on to say that it probably helped that I did not have much competition and that some others in the class held grudges. He was interrupted when someone hit him on the back of the neck with very large hands. Kendo introduced himself as my classmate and apologized for his friend's behavior, explaining that the other student resented Class 1A for not getting in and saw us as a group of posers. I told him that my classmates were not like that, aside from one problem student who they did not discuss. Kendo added that, in their book, I was cool and that as long as that aggressive student remained class representative I should be careful. I thanked him for the information and we parted ways. I walked to class alone. As soon as I arrived at school people began offering compliments. A few students remarked that I must be very smart for how I handled the situation yesterday, and others called me strong or impressive. The praise continued all the way to the classroom. A support student, May Hatsum, introduced herself and told me she was part of the support group in Class 1H. She then gushed about my costume and asked who had made it. I explained that the support team had a much larger budget and that I tended to scrounge for materials. May reacted with excitement when I admitted I had made the suit myself and praised the welding work and the information breaker on my visor. I noted for myself that the visor had night vision, heat vision, and a scanner for people, animals, and surroundings with only a small indicator on the side. May complimented the visor and blushed when I smiled in return. She asked if I would come over during lunch to work on equipment for the tournament. I agreed, and she clarified that support items were allowed in the tournament because the support teams made them themselves. I said I would meet her for lunch to work together, but not to use the equipment in competition. Bakugo approached and said something possessive about lunch, then put his arm around my waist in a possessive gesture. I thought he could be endearing when jealous. I started to explain the equipment conversation, but May left with an excited grin, teasing the situation as she departed. Bakugo suggested we hurry to class and offered to carry me if my legs still hurt, teasing me about flirting. He claimed that he knew about my feelings for him in a joking way and then hid his face briefly. He added that he still needed to reprimand me for what I did yesterday, and I swatted him on the head and said I had been joking about the previous comment, turning the tease back on him. As we entered the classroom, Kaminari teased them with a stream of nicknames aimed at me and Bakugo. Bakugo responded angrily and threatened in his usual fiery tone that he would take serious action against Kaminari's joking. The room fell silent with a slightly tense atmosphere, and Bakugo asked to start the lesson. Aizawa, the teacher, addressed Mineta, who was stuck to the window and causing a disturbance, and told the class they had permission to remove him. I used a small controlled maneuver to dislodge Mineta, and he tumbled down, prevented only by his usual sticky misadventure. Aizawa then announced that everyone would participate in the UA Sports Festival. The class reacted with a mix of fear and determination. Some students expressed concern that I might be dangerous if things went wrong. I explained that my success might have been as much about my plan as about my abilities, and that a straight-on attack could succeed against me. Kaminari replied that I was overestimating them. I told the class that I would not be using any special items and would rely on my own power. Aizawa summarized that there would be 3 events: a race, a team exercise, and a battle royale. Someone in the class asked how many days remained until the tournament. Aizawa answered that it was in 2 days. The class reacted with surprise and a flurry of nervous energy. Bakugo tried to motivate everyone in his own blunt way, and the others joked that his encouraging words were unexpected. Momo commented that people did not really know much about me, and Bakugo interjected with competitive taunts, challenging me directly and saying he would relish besting me. He told the class he was going to change and invited the rest to do the same. He left the room, and Bakugo became visibly angry on my behalf, saying the other student did not have the right to speak to me that way. I began to cry. Bakugo asked what was wrong and threatened to confront the student on my behalf. I wiped my tears and admitted that no matter what I did, people still seemed to dislike me. Izuku Midoriya feels suffocated by judgment. He takes a deep breath and tells himself that it is unfair. Bakugo pulls Izuku close to his chest and tells him that Izuku is scaring him, adding that he does not make excuses for anyone but Endeavor does not look like the nicest hero. Izuku stammers agreement. They walk to the changing room amid stares from the other students. Tsuyu asks Todoroki to apologize to Midoriya because he looks nervous. Todoroki starts to respond, but Midoriya assures Tsuyu that it is fine. Midoriya looks Todoroki directly in the eyes and explains that he wants to see Todoroki use his power against him. He wants a real challenge. Despite being the last one to arrive, Izuku is the first to change. Bakugo warns Todoroki that if anyone gets hurt, everyone will blame him. Todoroki replies to Kirishima that when he beats Izuku, Kirishima will have something else to worry about. Kirishima protests that taking it out on him is one thing, but other people should be left out of it. Todoroki asks Izuku whether he wants to be a hero. Izuku apologizes and inwardly feels he has connected with Todoroki. As they walk out into the arena, the crowd cheers. Midnight, the announcer, explains that the person with the highest score on the entrance exam in each class will give a speech. After Class 1B is called and Monoma gives Izuku a thumbs up, Midnight announces Izuku Midoriya as Class 1 as representative. Izuku steps forward and wishes everyone good luck, urging them to try their best and go beyond plus ultra. He exits to cheers and a section of enthusiastic fans. Midnight comes up behind Izuku, pats his back, and scolds him playfully for stealing her lines. She announces that the first challenge is an obstacle course. Midnight leads the class toward the course. Bakugo tells Izuku not to hold back and promises to push him hard. Todoroki echoes the sentiment. The students exchange good luck fist bumps. Midnight signals the start, and the students prepare. On her mark, she counts them in and the course begins. Robotic obstacles activate in a flashy display. Todoroki uses his quirk to freeze several robots and opponents in place, creating dramatic ice formations across the field. Izuku uses his quirk to blast a robot directly in front of him and melts a path through the ice with precise bursts of power. From his position, he sees Bakugo and Todoroki ahead, and Zero briefly in contention before Zero is knocked aside by an explosive trap. Zero appears shaken but not seriously hurt. Midnight reassures everyone that the explosive effects are for show and cannot physically harm them. Bakugo and Todoroki both use their quirks to propel themselves over obstacles, each trying to outdo the other. Izuku grabs a large piece of metal from a disabled robot and uses it as a makeshift shield. He times a jump onto one of the course's launch pads, which propels him forward and forces Bakugo and Todoroki out of his path. He stumbles into the tournament hall amid roaring cheers. Todoroki and Bakugo follow, and the crowd applauds each contestant as they finish. Midnight explains that only 42 top players will advance to the next round, which will involve a point system. She describes the scoring range and gives everyone an hour to rest. During the break in Class 1, as designated room, Monoma approaches Izuku and tells him to have good luck because he will need it. Izuku returns the sentiment and asks if something is bothering Monoma. Monoma admits that Izuku's kindness makes him feel guilty about competing against someone so earnest, and that he came to the tournament to challenge himself without remorse. Izuku, determined and intense, grabs Monoma's collar and warns him firmly to give his all in the competition. Monoma's expression turns apprehensive. Monoma quickly raises his hands in surrender, accepts the warning, and then offers a handshake to wish for a fair contest. They shake hands. The loudspeakers call everyone back to the tournament hall. Midnight returns to the stage and outlines the next phase, which is essentially a capture-the-flag-style event. Each team will have a flag worth a different number of points, and the top 4 teams with the most points will move on to the final round held over the next 3 days. She instructs everyone to form teams of 4. The audience cheers, and classmates begin to swarm Izuku with requests to join his team. Students call out their interest and pitch themselves as worthy teammates. Todoroki quietly approaches Izuku and asks to join his team, explaining that his father Endeavor is in the stands and that being seen working with certain classmates might cause complications. Todoroki admits, however, that Izuku reminds him of someone he is fond of and expresses a desire to be friends once the tournament is over. Todoroki offers his hand to seal the agreement. Izuku agrees and informs Todoroki that he plans to include Bakugo and Kaminari on the team. Todoroki asks for clarification. Izuku refers to them by their nicknames and invites them both. Bakugo promptly appears and more or less drags Kaminari along, gruffly announcing that he heard his name called. Bakugo accepts the invitation with a dramatic gesture, and Kaminari agrees sheepishly. The team comes together, ready for the next challenge and the fierce but friendly rivalries ahead. Midoriya volunteered to join the formation. He described the human pyramid with himself on top, Kami directly beneath him, and Kaken and Shochan beneath Kami. He could not remember exactly how he convinced them to accept that arrangement, only that he had joked they needed the 2 strongest males to support everyone. Midnight called the start of the match. Almost on cue, all the Class 1A teams launched into action, but Monoma's group behaved differently. Midoriya could not see what was happening until he checked the scoreboard and realized Monoma's team had just claimed all the points. Kirishima's team rushed in to try to snatch a flag, and Midoriya warned his teammates to avoid Monoma. He directed his warning mostly at Kaken, pointing out that Monoma was copying quirks. Kaken brushed it off, confident and angry as always. Kaken's bravado turned into action as he charged. Monoma managed to reach out and touch someone in the formation. He had tried to copy Midoriya's quirk. The attempt backfired. Monoma clutched his hand and his sleeve was suddenly singed, the fabric blackened at the edge. Midoriya realized with relief that his quirk reacted strangely under extreme emotion and could cause heat. Kaken snapped at Monoma, taunting him about the pain, and Midoriya urged Kaken to focus. Suddenly Midoriya felt breath close behind him. A teammate called for Hagakure and Todoroki to stop. Todoroki used his ice ability to create a barrier that blocked Hagakure and sent her stumbling to the ground. The stadium microphone announced that Team Midoriya had just taken down Team Hagakure and that the match was getting intense with only a few minutes left. 2 minutes remained on the clock. An opponent Tsu launched toward their formation with her long tongue. Midoriya moved quickly, using it against her in a controlled, non-harmful way and sending her to the ground with an apologetic apology that kept the action light and energetic rather than brutal. An ambush followed. Midoriya asked Kaken to blast through the attackers, but worried that an explosion would allow opponents to snatch a headband. He reminded Kami to use his quirk instead, and Kami obliged, taking care not to hit anyone by accident. The coordinated team effort pushed their way through the ring. Kaken agreed to do one risky thing Midoriya asked of him. Despite their rivalry, Kaken obliged, and Midoriya acknowledged that Kaken's explosions were nothing to underestimate. The team completed the maneuver just in time. The commentator announced that Midoriya's team had flown through the ring and landed back in the arena with 10 seconds to spare, and the scoreboard ended that match. Midoriya felt the relief as they all climbed down from the pyramid. As he ran across the field, Kaken demanded to know where he was going. Midoriya intended to apologize to Monoma. Kaken protested that Monoma had brought his trouble on himself, but Midoriya kept going and approached Monoma's team. He checked Monoma's arm and asked if he was all right, and then Monoma admitted that someone had copied his quirk and been burned trying to use it. Midoriya denied having used his quirk on Monoma, and Monoma confessed he had wanted to shake Midoriya's hand. They exchanged a brief, awkward moment, and Monoma shrugged it off with a comment about fairness in tournaments. Their classmates praised the strategy that had let the stronger members of the team secure a win. Tetsu, the boy with steel skin, walked up and declared his confidence that his own team would win the next challenge. Kendo pulled him back by the ear to calm him down, joking that she would put herself on call if anyone needed reining in. Midoriya thanked them and returned to his platform, until Todoroki stopped him and asked to speak in private. Todoroki led Midoriya down to a quieter walkway near the train center. They leaned against opposite walls and spoke without the noise of the arena. Todoroki asked if Midoriya's quirk was the kind that made people fall in love with him. He explained that when he was younger his mother had hurt him severely with boiling water, and that experience had made it difficult for him to express emotions. He admitted that meeting Midoriya had changed something in him and made him feel things he could not easily name. Todoroki asked Midoriya not to deny what was happening among their classmates. He pointed out how many people seemed drawn to Midoriya. Midoriya protested that those people were just his friends, but Todoroki took a steady breath and asked, quietly, for a hug. Midoriya felt a wave of relief and agreed. The hug was a sincere and calming moment. Todoroki held him a little tighter than usual, and Midoriya noticed a warm scent, which Todoroki mentioned as cinnamon in a soft voice. Midoriya offered a grateful, slightly embarrassed reply. An explosion of noise cut through the moment. Kaken charged between them, shouting possessive declarations in his typical blustering way and insisting that Midoriya belonged to him. Bakugo's intensity and rough language were his usual mix of rivalry and fierce attachment. The exchange drew both of their friends' attention. They teased and laughed about the absurdity and the unlikeliest reunion of rivalries on display. Kaken and another rival traded barbs about nicknames and past grievances but agreed they should conserve their energy for the next challenge, offering a final, begrudging bit of sportsmanship. Midoriya, trying to break the tension and keep things light, pressed a quick, friendly peck to each of them on the cheek. Both rivals froze in surprise, stunned into silence, and Midoriya slipped away toward the locker rooms to change. As he headed off, a pro-hero stopped him and ordered him to stay away from the hero's son. Midoriya refused, saying no, and the hero demanded clarification. Midoriya maintained his refusal, leaving the confrontation unresolved as he moved on. Endeavor reminded Izuku that being the number 2 hero did not place him above the law or the school. He demanded to know who Izuku thought he was, arguing that public attention did not make someone number 1. Izuku acknowledged the point and walked away, telling Endeavor that being Shoto's father did not make him Shoto. Izuku returned to the locker room and received congratulations from everyone. He did not know that Todoroki had overheard the exchange. Fighting day arrived and Izuku was scheduled to face Hitoshi first. Hitoshi observed that after Bakugo and Uraraka finished, it would be their turn. Izuku smiled. He knew Hitoshi used a voice modulator but still knew little about his quirk. Hitoshi admitted that he might say things from the stage that he did not mean, rubbing the back of his neck. Izuku told him he could call him Izuku and urged him to go all out in the match without holding back. Hitoshi chuckled and nodded. Bakugo certainly was not holding back in his match. He looked exhausted when he finished putting the rocks down, and then he detonated them in a show of power that left the audience reacting loudly. The crowd booed after his win, which confused Izuku. He thought Bakugo had done exactly what was expected. During the intermission, Izuku went to speak to Bakugo and Uraraka. Uraraka blushed slightly before heading off to talk with Tsuyu. Uraraka asked Izuku why he had not been cheering for her. Izuku explained that he had been conditioned to expect an explosive, angry reaction from Bakugo whenever he showed him any positive attention, so he had learned to hold back outward support. Bakugo accepted the explanation, then asked if Izuku would be facing the old purple Deku, a nickname Bakugo used for Shinso. Bakugo also mentioned that some kids in middle school had teased him with a nickname, a detail that surprised Izuku. Bakugo chuckled and offered a small, friendly gesture meant for luck before walking away. Several others asked for the same gesture and were turned down. A sense of dread crept over Izuku as he headed toward the arena. He felt confident in his strength from past battles, but he did not understand how Shinsu's quirk worked, and that uncertainty felt like a serious disadvantage. The announcement called Midoriya Izuku vs. Shinso Hitoshi. They walked into the arena and Izuku immediately tried to rush Hitoshi, but Hitoshi's voice quirk began to take effect. Hitoshi spoke in a steady voice intended to unsettle and manipulate, suggesting that Izuku had loved the praise from his quirk and implying that people had always looked down on and hated him. The words felt like a foreign current, and Izuku found his body resisting movement as if he were an observer watching a scene unfold rather than an active participant. Although immobilized, Izuku discovered he could still use his quirk. He summoned a ring of fire, which startled Hitoshi and briefly broke his concentration. Seizing the opportunity, Izuku closed the distance without speaking, extinguished the fire, and executed a clean judo throw that sent Hitoshi out of the ring. It had taken effort to get close while they had been exchanging blows, but Izuku managed it and won the match. Afterward, Izuku reached out to help Hitoshi to his feet. Hitoshi accepted the hand, and they shared a brief, sincere hug. Izuku asked Hitoshi not to spread falsehoods about him on international television, a quiet request spoken close enough for Hitoshi alone to hear. The microphone did not pick up the exchange over the roar of fans, and the announcers declared Izuku the winner. The audience cheered as they were escorted from the arena. In the recovery room, the nurse entered just as Hitoshi lifted the side of his shirt to reveal a large bruise. The nurse reacted with concern and apologized for the roughness of the match. Hitoshi waved it off, saying it was part of the competition and that he regretted making things difficult. He also acknowledged that he had said harsh things during the match and that he had pushed hard to win. Izuku admitted that the situation was partly his fault, explaining that he had grown up with limited control over his quirk and had often pretended not to have it at all rather than risk people judging him for being bad at it. Hitoshi listened and told Izuku he understood. Hitoshi said Izuku was a good liar in the sense of hiding things, but he believed Izuku could not truly hide from him if Izuku chose to be honest. He added that if the matter was a family secret he would not pry, but he respected Izuku's ability to deduce and see things others missed. With that, Hitoshi left the recovery room. As Izuku headed back upstairs to rejoin his classmates, he noticed Denki Kaminari openly complimenting Hitoshi, telling him he had done well and had almost beaten Izuku. A friend told him it was impressive and suggested he train with them later. Mina cut in, telling him that as much as she loved her ships, he needed to go out in 5 minutes. Izuku started running down the stairs. He slid up beside her and told her that Shinso and Denki reminded him a lot of Aizawa-sensei and present Michael. Mina looked confused for a second, then put her hands together and took a deep breath, saying she understood everything except present Michael. Izuku responded that he was the only intellectual there. Most of them chuckled while Todoroki and Shinso reacted in the corner. He received more congratulations. Bakugo came over and slung his arm around Izuku's shoulder, remarking that he had expected Izuku to be the same as always but that Izuku still managed to surprise him. Bakugo then challenged Izuku to beat up the moody opponent over there before they fought each other. He demanded a fiery response and smacked Izuku on the head when Izuku hesitated. Izuku complied with a defiant reply in the way Bakugo expected. Ida, Uraraka, Shinso, Kaminari, Mina, and Kirishima burst in and Kirishima called for a protection squad to take Bakugo on. Todoroki asked what Bakugo had done, and when Izuku explained, Todoroki took off after Bakugo while Izuku laughed. Izuku wondered how things had turned out this way. He had gone from being the victim to being popular, with friends even among his rivals. He let his back hit the wall, looked up, and sighed happily that he loved his life. An announcement called Todoroki Shoto and Midoriya Izuku to the arena. Todoroki went left, so Izuku chose the right side, trying to make it easier on him. He grew nervous with every step. Hitoshi was strong and Izuku admitted he did not fully understand Hitoshi's quirk, which had an intimidating effect, but he did know Todoroki's quirk, half fire, half ice. He thought it unfair that Todoroki had 2 elements and seemed to use only one, but acknowledged Todoroki's right to make his own choices. When the doors opened, Todoroki attacked with ice almost immediately. The ice almost hit Izuku, but his fear triggered his quirk and his arms flared with fire. The crowd erupted in cheers, especially students from Class 1A, Class 1B, and May's class. An icicle struck his arm and the heat of his own power reacted, leaving his arm painfully scorched. Izuku told himself to fight back, but he had held himself back deliberately. If he was only going to go halfway, he would go 0%, and the fact he was still standing meant something. Commentators wondered aloud how Todoroki was only using ice while Izuku refused to use his own full power, speculating that Izuku must have a trick. Izuku shouted that he would not win like this and that it was Todoroki's choice to rely on his quirk. A spark seemed to ignite in Todoroki's eyes and he unleashed his fire side, setting the arena alight in a dramatic burst. Izuku saved his ultimate move for later, then used his fire-enhanced feet to propel himself forward. He moved under Todoroki's right arm, grabbed his wrist with his right hand, slipped his left through a small opening, and delivered a swift kick to Todoroki's ankles that sent Todoroki tumbling and losing consciousness. The announcer declared Izuku the winner and the crowd cheered. Izuku slung Todoroki over his shoulder, prompting even louder screams from some of the onlookers. Bakugo ran up, demanded to know what had happened, and punched Izuku in the shoulder, which brought a rush of pain that Izuku had been masking. The pain made him drop Todoroki. Izuku called for help, laughing through the pain and realizing he had overestimated himself. He remembered blacking out and then waking up in the hospital wing where Todoroki and Bakugo sat in chairs. Bakugo immediately apologized fiercely. Todoroki stood, looking at the wall and muttering under his breath. Bakugo grabbed Izuku by the shoulders and told Todoroki to leave, blaming Todoroki for ruining Izuku's arm and demanding that Todoroki show he was sorry. Izuku tried to take responsibility as he always did, but Bakugo insisted that Izuku stop blaming himself for everything and actually think about how he acted. Izuku told Bakugo that he would explain everything after the tournament and suggested Bakugo get some rest. Bakugo gave a silent nod, then leaned forward to press a quick peck to Izuku's cheek as a parting gesture he called revenge. Izuku felt a small blush spread across his face. He tapped Todoroki on the shoulder to get his attention and Todoroki slid off the chair. Todoroki greeted Midoriya and asked how he was feeling. Midoriya answered that he was fine and asked how Todoroki was doing. Todoroki covered his face with his hand and complained that it was too bright. Midoriya laughed and took the chair Kaken had been sitting in. Todoroki apologized for what he had done to Midoriya's hand. Midoriya told him it was fine, but Todoroki insisted it was not and said he felt terrible about hurting him. Todoroki explained that even while unconscious he had heard Midoriya screaming in pain, and when he had woken up everyone had looked like they wanted to kill him. Midoriya told him that now he knew how it felt. Todoroki looked confused and asked what Midoriya was talking about and suggested that everyone loved him, even Bakugo. Midoriya explained that his quirk had manifested 2 years earlier in 8th grade, that he had once been the weak, awkward kid who rode around on Kaken's coattails, and that nothing much had changed until he had done something that made Kaken and others see him as a threat. When Todoroki asked what he had done, Midoriya admitted that he had pretended to be suicidal because of Kaken. He winced as he said it and tried to rethink his words. Todoroki confessed that he had never known Midoriya could be suicidal. Midoriya chuckled and hastened to clarify that he had never actually been suicidal. He was good at manipulating situations to get results, and he reminded Todoroki that he had managed to get him to use his quirk. Todoroki looked utterly confused and demanded to know whether everything about Midoriya was a lie. Midoriya bristled and told Todoroki not to act like he knew everything. He admitted that he had been furious that someone with 2 powerful quirks was only using one and that it felt unfair. Todoroki snapped that his father only cared about himself. Midoriya replied that the same was true of his own father and that he did not even know who his father was. They stood and raised their voices at each other, and Midoriya insisted that he had meant every harsh thing he had said earlier, that it was Todoroki's quirk and he should use it if he wanted to be a hero. Todoroki's expression softened, and he fell back into the chair and laughed. He told Midoriya that he was full of surprises and smiled up at him. Midoriya smiled in return. Todoroki wished him luck in the upcoming match. Midoriya promised to help Todoroki confront his father if he won as a way to celebrate, and Todoroki said that sounded like fun. Midoriya stayed in the hospital overnight but was fine by morning. Recovery Girl warned him to be careful and not to underdo things, teasing that next time she might heal him the old-fashioned way if he wasn't more careful. Midoriya asked how she had known about his attempt to make it look like he had been struggling. Recovery Girl explained that Aizawa had told her everything and that she paid close attention during fights to make sure no one was in danger. As Midoriya left the recovery room, he noticed someone clinging to the window outside, shouting threats. The voice was muffled but clearly aimed at him. Midoriya shouted something back, and the person slipped from the window and fell. Midoriya watched as the person tumbled away, then continued down the hallway. Midoriya walked to the cafe craving a cheese croissant and felt odd looks from people as he passed. He saw Todoroki sitting alone and sat beside him. Todoroki offered to move, but Midoriya waved him off and said he just wanted Todoroki's croissant. Todoroki handed it over and Midoriya started eating. Todoroki asked if Midoriya was nervous. Midoriya swallowed a mouthful and said he was not really nervous. He could have beaten Todoroki quickly if he wanted to, but he wanted to make an impression. Todoroki asked why he had held back. Midoriya admitted he had wanted to rile Todoroki's father, to prove he could get Todoroki to use his quirk when his father could not. Todoroki asked if Midoriya always had an ulterior motive, and Midoriya grinned and said a little. Todoroki joked that Midoriya needed a suit and a glass of wine to twirl around, and Midoriya said he would not turn down a free tux. The tension in the room eased. A staff member came by to remind Midoriya that he would be on in 30 minutes and suggested he start heading to the arena. Midoriya dismissed the praise, saying he preferred to keep his ego in check and that anyone who treated Todoroki poorly could answer to him. Midoriya ran through the halls with confidence, having learned the layout in his short time there. He nearly turned the wrong way and ran into Kaken. Kaken complained about the wrong turn and warned Midoriya that everyone would try to beat him up. Midoriya joked about nitroglycerin, and Kaken asked why he would ever taste that. Midoriya said there was no reason and kept moving. Midoriya reached the terminal just as the doors opened. The announcer declared the highly anticipated match between Bakugo Katsuki and Btw Izuku. The crowd cheered loudly. Kaken immediately launched into the fight, and Midoriya used the pressure from Kaken's blast to propel himself upward. Time seemed to slow as Midoriya navigated the height. He channeled his power and created glass-like spikes in the arena as a surprise tactic. The announcer noted the sudden display of technique. The move worked. Kaken was forced to retreat, showing that he had taken some hits, while Midoriya was left with only a small scrape on his cheek. Kaken lashed out and detonated the glass, accusing Midoriya of playing dirty. Midoriya shot back that it was a reasonable expectation. Kaken followed with another powerful explosion, which Midoriya dodged with an aerial twist. Midoriya raised a wall of fire between them to push Kaken back, then closed the distance and landed a solid blow that staggered Kaken and left him reeling. Kaken retaliated with a direct blast aimed at Midoriya's face. Midoriya flipped backward through the air and landed on his knees among scattered fragments from their clash. His protective gear and uniform prevented serious harm, letting him regroup for the next exchange. Izuku quickly dusted the glass from his pants while Katsuki wiped his nose. They began sprinting toward each other, using their quirks to launch themselves over the ring. The contest was simple. The first person to pull out would lose. Izuku feigned seriousness, then moved left and tripped Katsuki. He slammed his right elbow into Katsuki's back, but Katsuki twisted his hand and unleashed another explosion that sent Izuku flying out of the ring. Izuku pushed himself back up. When he landed, Katsuki's hand was close to his face. Izuku thought Katsuki's hand would be rough, but it felt surprisingly soft. Katsuki braced, ready to detonate, and Izuku prepared to counter. Remembering his own flair for pyrokinesis, Izuku redirected the blast and propelled Katsuki out of the ring. Before Katsuki could react, Izuku leapt and kicked him in the stomach, sending him crashing out of bounds. Izuku followed and landed on top of him briefly. Katsuki groaned. Izuku asked if Katsuki was all right and Katsuki winced as he stood. Katsuki began to cry, then hugged Izuku tightly and whispered that he loved him, calling Izuku a stupid idiot in a muffled, urgent voice. The girls in the crowd cheered even louder at the display. Someone from the stands teased that Katsuki seemed to enjoy being challenged, which made both of them flush and laugh. Katsuki punched Izuku lightly in the shoulder, which only made Izuku giggle, and then they shared a shy exchange of affection. The arena announcer declared Izuku the winner of the UA Sports Festival, and cheers erupted through the stands. Izuku stood, helped Katsuki to his feet, and checked for injuries. The moment was warm and messy and full of the competitive, stubborn affection that had defined their relationship. After the celebration, Izuku returned to class. Shoji was the first to greet him and called him their champion. Izuku greeted everyone and sat down, pulling out his notebook, but Aizawa told him he would not need it for the day and to put it away. Aizawa mentioned a party at the Todoroki estate and, after a dry aside about responsibility, announced more important news. Since the sports festival, students had been invited to join pro heroes or companies for one-week internships. It was an opportunity to gain real-world experience. Aizawa displayed a screen showing which heroes and companies had requested which students. The top requests were Izuku, Katsuki, Shochan, and Tokoyami. Aizawa then began handing out assignment slips. Momo asked what to do if no one had requested a student, and Aizawa reassured her that they could still choose from a list on the handout and that they could discuss options quietly. Izuku scanned his own list and nearly dismissed most of the requests until he saw one name, Hawks. A loud thud against his desk made him look up as Katsuki teased him about who he had been matched with. Katsuki guessed Hawks, noting that Hawks was the new hero who had not attended UA and that he heard Hawks did not take sidekicks. Izuku found the situation odd and wondered who he would choose. Katsuki then shifted into a more irreverent mood, declaring that the only people he cared about were Izuku, his parents, and, to a lesser extent, Shochan and someone he derisively nicknamed. Izuku teased him back and pulled from his backpack a small package he had taken home from the party a few weeks earlier. He had been too tired that night to see who gave it to him. All he remembered from the party was making sure Katsuki did not break anything and Katsuki making a crude, joking comment about messing up Endeavor's reputation. Izuku called Shochan over and asked if Shochan had invited anyone to the party. Shochan said Izuku had invited everyone. Izuku showed the small package and asked Shochan to open it. Inside was a dark silver butterfly knife, which surprised both of them. Izuku examined it and found a small latch that revealed a hidden comb. He carefully fit the comb into the base. They joked that whoever had given the gift was telling Izuku to fix his hair. To provoke a reaction, Izuku flicked the legs of Katsuki's chair. Katsuki yelped as his head bumped the desk. Aizawa emerged from his sleeping bag, told Katsuki to be quiet, and slid back in. The class stifled laughter. Katsuki grumped about being mean but then sat back down and ribbed Izuku with affection in his own blunt way. They exchanged teasing insults that, beneath the surface, were affectionate. Katsuki asked Izuku if he wanted to walk around a church and hold hands, and Izuku laughed, saying that this was one of the reasons he loved Katsuki. They talked for a few minutes, until Izuku noticed that Tenya Ida was absent. When Izuku asked, Katsuki had no idea. The bell rang and Aizawa collected papers as the students filed out. Izuku was the last to leave and asked Aizawa where Ida was. Aizawa explained that Ida's brother had been sent to the hospital by a villain and that Ida had gone to be with him, though he could not provide further details. Izuku expressed concern and agreed with Uraraka when she suggested they should visit. The conversation turned briefly to other classmates, and Uraraka reported that things with her and Tsuyu were going well. The students left the classroom with the new assignments in hand, uneasy at the thought of Ida's brother and anticipating the internships that would shape their next steps. They talked about Bakugo. Midoriya thought Bakugo was a JRK most of the time but admitted he had a tsundere streak. Uraraka said she had heard they would pick their hero names after the internship and announced hers would be Uravity. Midoriya decided his would be Deku. When Midoriya teased that if Bakugo used Kaken as a name someone might draw embarrassing fan art of them, Momo laughed and quickly changed the subject. Midoriya pulled out a pen, lowered his sleeve, and wrote a brief note to look something up later. They were interrupted by Ida, who strode over briskly and scolded them for dawdling. Midoriya asked about Ida's brother. Ida explained that his brother had been seriously injured by the hero killer Stain and had been left with lasting injuries. Ida vowed to seek justice. Midoriya acknowledged that Stain had a twisted philosophy. He objected to murder but admitted that Stain's critique of villains who became heroes for money had a perverse logic. Ida and Uraraka stared at him in alarm while he clarified that he did not condone violence. Uraraka teased Midoriya about spending too much time with his boyfriend, warning that he would start calling Ida Four Eyes and Kaminari Dunce Face. Midoriya responded with a joking insult about Kaminari that made Uraraka give him a mock-threatening look. He imagined that if Bakugo turned out anything like his father, Shinso might end up dating Kaminari. Ida explained his internship placement as manual, and the others revealed theirs. One said Hawks, another joked about Gundam because of MMA training, and Midoriya mumbled that he had a GG about bringing a gun if you couldn't get into UA, which caused some bewilderment. They traded more teasing until Ida became distracted by the idea of Midoriya being a monk figure. He and another friend got down into a mock prayer pose until Uraraka shouted that the floor was dirty and they sprang up, wiping themselves off. Uraraka then made an outrageous remark that stunned the group and caused a brief, awkward silence. Bakugo passed out nearby, which shifted everyone's attention and left them scrambling to react. Midoriya arrived at the Hawks Hero Agency expecting to see Tokoyami, but he was not there. He reflected that agencies often had limited roles and that Tokoyami probably had no choice in assignments. He knocked, and the door opened. Hawks recognized Midoriya and told him to come in and drop the formalities. They rode the elevator to Hawks's office. Hawks invited Midoriya to sit, and Midoriya kept his posture stiff until Hawks told him to relax. Once settled, Midoriya noticed the sofa was surprisingly comfortable and that Hawks wore subtle eyeliner. Midoriya asked what they would be doing that day. Hawks explained that they would go on patrol and then attend a public interview, suggesting Midoriya might get good exposure. Midoriya noted that Hawks flew during patrol. Hawks corrected him, saying Midoriya had misread his quirk as telekinesis. His quirk involved pyrokinesis and subtle control, and he sometimes felt insecure comparing himself to other powers. Midoriya told him not to worry about other people's expectations and then asked how Hawks could afford such an office. Hawks looked panicked for a moment, then composed himself and admitted Midoriya had a point. Midoriya hesitated, then demonstrated a small trick he had been experimenting with, making himself float. Hawks reacted with genuine surprise and excitement at the display. Midoriya explained briefly that his experiment had involved manipulating air currents and pressure at his shoes rather than any pyrotechnics, and he tapped the sole of his left shoe to emphasize the point. Hawks pointed out small stainless steel compartments and explained how his feathers were arranged. Izuku remembered the joking aside about chemistry class that it had taught him strange things about toxins and safety, and Hawks had laughed nervously in reply. When Izuku asked how to turn the feathers off, Hawks said they deactivated when their fire was not used. Hawks also joked that if he ever became a villain and took over the world, Izuku would follow his every command without hesitation. Izuku went up behind him and asked if he could take one of Hawks' feathers. Hawks agreed and told him he would be protected if he ever tried to take over the world. Izuku slipped a feather into his notebook. Hawks led Izuku down a stairway toward a crowd of paparazzi. The reporters immediately bombarded Hawks with questions until they quieted down enough for one to call out whether the rumors about Izuku Midoriya's sexuality and a relationship with Katsuki Bakugo were true. Izuku noticed the question barely mattered. This was well into a time when people had largely accepted others loving whoever they wanted, but he still felt the weight of the attention. One man in the crowd sneered about the reporter's clothes to shut down the religious preaching, and the rest of the exchange moved on without further incident. Hawks received most of the questions about public safety and quirk use because he was a top hero, but the crowd moved on when security escorted them away. As they separated, Hawks told Izuku that he could take the east route while Hawks took the west. Before leaving, Hawks produced something from his jacket and handed it to Izuku, explaining that Izuku was now allowed to use his quirk in public. Izuku asked if Hawks was even allowed to grant that. Hawks admitted that normally he could not, but he had spoken with Izuku's teacher and the relevant departments to arrange it. He made an offhand remark about mentioning Japan and laughed at himself. Izuku thanked Hawks and watched him go, thinking that the top hero seemed refreshingly unconcerned with money compared to others. Izuku did not spot anyone suspicious at first, and he was not moving quickly when he saw Ida collapsed on the ground. He flew down immediately and put a hand on Ida's chest to check for breathing. Ida warned Izuku that the fight was not his, but before Izuku could respond, a blade rushed past his face. Izuku narrowly avoided it and turned to find Stain standing there, an unwelcome surprise. Stain taunted Izuku with accusations about fake heroes, and Izuku moved to intervene. Izuku told Stain that his mission of violence was wrong and that he was going to stop him for Ida's sake. Stain pressed his own ideas about heroism, and the exchange became heated. Izuku lunged, igniting his fist in flame as he closed the distance. Stain tried to dodge, but Izuku twisted and redirected his arm, managing to strike and throw one of Stain's knives back toward him as a warning shot. Stain fought with the fervor of someone preaching ideology while acting like a villain, and for a moment Izuku's warning seemed to register. Izuku's quick action allowed him to message his ally Shochan with their location while keeping Stain's attention away from Ida. Ida struggled to move and said he could not get up, so Izuku focused on defending him. The battle continued in tense bursts. The fight shifted when a sharp sting appeared along Izuku's cheek. He felt the impact, but nothing graphic, and blood or serious wound images were avoided. Stain commented that Izuku had made an impression and that he would spare Izuku, but he intended harm for the others. Izuku's instinct to react immediately threatened to escalate everything, and he prepared to disable Stain decisively when an ice wall suddenly rose to shield Ida. Todoroki arrived and formed an ice barrier around Ida. Todoroki reprimanded Izuku for not sending more information with his alert, explaining that his father had tried to stop him from coming. Todoroki advised caution because Stain could paralyze a target through ingestion of a substance, with effects varying by blood type or amount, so everyone needed to keep their distance. Todoroki asked Izuku to back him up, and Izuku agreed. Todoroki used both his ice and fire in tandem to contain Stain, and Izuku breathed a little easier watching the coordinated effort. A knife flew toward Todoroki's face, aimed to pierce the ice, but the blade melted as if by heat. Someone unseen had redirected the attack with a blue flame that Izuku did not recognize. Izuku noticed the knife dissolving and acknowledged the help. The person who intervened made it clear they wished to remain anonymous. Meanwhile, Ida broke free from the ice prison around him, and Izuku felt his own paralysis lift at the same time. Ida called out to Izuku, and the group readied themselves for the next phase of the confrontation. The situation remained dangerous, but with allies arriving and coordination improving, they had a chance to protect civilians and bring the fight to a safer end. Ida stood up and announced that he could not take the name Ingenium if he could not protect his friends. He ran toward Stain and Izuku followed. Todoroki used his fire to force Stain into a corner. Izuku thought it could not be true that someone could change so quickly. Izuku ignited his leg and Ida activated his engines. Together they delivered a hard kick that landed with a sharp impact. Someone expressed relief that it was over, worried the rest of the class might attack if Izuku had been hurt again. One of them instructed Shochan to find some rope, told Ida to go help the injured man they could not clearly identify from a distance, and said he would make sure the knocked-out assailant stayed down. A whisper came from Stain, who was still conscious. He commented that Izuku's kick had improved and observed that the League of Villains liked him. Even without the quirk they sought, he did not fight like a hero. Izuku prepared to respond. Stain produced a dagger and then suddenly went limp. Izuku retrieved the dagger. They bound Stain with rope and walked out of the alley, where they were met by a group of heroes. Hawks approached and asked how it felt to nab a first villain. Izuku said it made him feel confident. Hawks replied that they needed to check him for injuries. As Izuku began toward the ambulance, a Nomu grabbed him and lifted him off the ground. Izuku could not use his quirk, and he could not reach the dagger. Then Stain intervened, catching Izuku during the chaos. When they reached the ground, Stain released him and raised his hands, claiming he would not let a promising fighter go to waste. The police moved in and handcuffed Stain. After things settled, Ida apologized to Izuku for getting him into the mess and for acting selfishly. Ida admitted he felt unfit to bear the title of hero and asked Izuku how he managed to be so kind and determined. Izuku explained that in junior high he had been a nervous, insecure kid who rarely used his quirk and who decided he did not want to stay that way. He said that the desire to change had come from within him, not from bullying or anyone else, and that only a person could choose to change themselves. Ida smiled and thanked him. They were all in the hospital. Someone woke Izuku, and Shochan told him to let him sleep while pulling the blanket away. Shochan informed Izuku that the chief of police was present. Izuku tried to pretend he was not there, then rubbed his eyes, sat up, and faced the chief. The chief explained that normally people without a hero license could not use their quirks in public, but that Izuku had been given exclusive permission that night, so he would be credited as the person who stopped Stain. Izuku protested that it felt unfair and asked what the alternative would be. The chief said the other option would have been to credit Endeavor, but the decision had been made to acknowledge Izuku's role. Izuku told them at least to let him pretend he did not care. Someone pointed out that Izuku should take the opportunity because things could have ended much worse without him. Shoto and Izuku traded quiet acknowledgments about who did what during the fight, and when the discussion turned to media coverage, Izuku sighed and accepted that he would appear on the front cover. He yawned and tried to smooth his hair as the chief promised to inform the press. As people left the room, Izuku checked his backpack. It was still there. He muttered a list under his breath, and Shochan teased that he would throw something at him. Izuku tossed a spare water bottle toward Shochan, who dodged. The bottle nearly hit Ida, who shrugged it off and apologized. They dressed in their regular clothes and continued the day, sharing lunch together. Later, Shoto asked Izuku if he wanted to meet his mother. They walked to the hospital room together. Shoto's mother sat facing the window and brightened when she saw Izuku, saying she had been eager to meet the young man Shoto always talked about. Izuku smiled and took a seat. Shoto's mother told him that Shoto spoke often of his friend, praising his kindness and strength. Shoto protested that he should not have lied to his mother, but when he began to argue, Izuku gently placed a finger to his lips to quiet him. Shoto's mother laughed and said she liked Izuku. Shoto feigned indignation about ages, and they traded light-hearted, teasing remarks about memes before the moment passed. She laughed. She told him that he reminded her of her son. Someone then asked Shoto how many people he had killed, wanting to compare, and Shoto looked scared. She asked a little nervously whether she should be worried. He explained that he had only pretended to be a villain in one challenge and that a murder joke had stirred everyone up. A classmate accused him of seriously injuring a girl during the incident. I inhaled and insisted for the last time that she had run into the wall. The woman noticed the resemblance again and said that he definitely reminded her of her son, reckless but always willing to protect the people he cared about. She observed that their eyes were similar, hers bright green and his bright blue, and that both had fire-related abilities, though his flames were blue. I had a sudden flashback to the man at the party with blue eyes and a fire quirk who had protected Shoto. I told them that I thought I had seen him before. They responded that it was impossible. He had run away a couple of years ago and they did not blame him. I said I just felt like I had seen someone like that before. The rest of the visit went smoothly. I went home, slept, and woke up the next day. My mother lectured me, but it ended with her saying she was proud of me. The next morning I went to school and was greeted by a chorus of congratulations that started to wear on me. When I finally reached the classroom and stepped inside, laughter greeted me. Siro shouted Bakugo's name and covered his mouth. Bakugo explained that something had been done to him, that he had washed his hair 3 times and it still would not come out. The classmates erupted with teasing. One joked that he looked like Monoma if Monoma were the devil. Another said he looked like a Pomeranian whose hopes and dreams had been crushed. Someone else teased that he looked like a bad original character from Code Geass. One more remarked that he looked like a 9-year-old who still played Fortnite, and another scoffed that those games were ancient. I tried to change the subject. Bakugo told him not to say that in public and swatted his head, hair puffing back. Izuku noted that whatever he had done had worked. Bakugo touched his head in surprise and flushed, promising he would take care of it later. Bakugo told him to be quiet as they sat down. As soon as Izuku took his seat, the class bombarded him with questions about Stain. He grabbed Bakugo's hand and brought it to his face, then made an inappropriate remark. The moment passed. Bakugo exploded in his face, asking if he was trying to get himself killed. Izuku replied that it had simply not worked and asked him to try again. Bakugo refused and grumbled while Izuku wiped soot from his face. Uraraka suggested that maybe Izuku did not want to talk about Stain, and everyone fell silent as Aizawa entered the room. Aizawa recognized the class's excitement about the Stain news and warned them that if they had actually fought a serial killer, they might not be so eager to discuss it. He moved to the podium and announced that today was one of the most important days in their hero careers. They were to choose their hero names. Momo stood and questioned whether it was responsible to let teenagers decide their names. Aizawa replied dryly that the wrong name could haunt you and joked about the complications names could bring. He also reminded them that they only got one choice and that Midnight was supposed to be there to help as well. Uraraka approached Izuku and asked about his name choice. Izuku decided on Deku and Uraraka said she would go with Uravity. Ida hesitated about taking Ingenium again and admitted that seeing Izuku had made him doubt whether he was worthy of that name anymore. Izuku denied meaning to discourage him. The two of them fumbled awkwardly while Izuku tapped his pencil on the desk. The class murmured appreciatively at the exchange. A few minutes later they were in Midnight's class. When it came to Izuku's turn, he stood and declared Deku as his hero name. Bakugo stood immediately after and insisted on being called Kaken. Aizawa remarked that their chosen names looked like the nicknames they had already given each other and compared them to a pair he remembered. He told them now was not the time for such digressions. A few days after the whole Stain incident, things returned mostly to normal except for the press starting to treat All Might differently. People still flocked to see him, but their attention wavered. Izuku imagined being on television, answering questions about what it was like to have an idol like All Might and explaining that he wanted to support people even if they had no quirks. He ran up to Bakugo, teasing him with affectionate nicknames and asking if Bakugo was still angry about Izuku being reckless. Bakugo did not respond at first, and Izuku tried more playful pet names to break the tension. When that failed, Izuku decided to go bother Shoto instead. Bakugo suddenly snapped that the person was his and no one else's. Izuku pushed back lightly, and Bakugo told him to shut up. Izuku met Bakugo's eyes and repeated the request to stop using that tone with him. Bakugo looked pale with emotion and admitted that he found Izuku intimidating, reminding everyone of how Izuku had done well at the sports festival, stood up to villains, and even saved people in dangerous situations. Izuku, in turn, noted that he had learned head injuries could be serious and that they had all been shaken by some of their recent encounters. Bakugo argued that his own threats of greatness were not meant to intimidate but to push himself to be the best. Izuku answered that Bakugo often came across as blustering bravado, the kind of person who might romanticize a fight and then be surprised when trouble turned violent. Bakugo dismissed the idea of such melodrama and quipped that he would not go on a creepy date with someone who liked cannibalism. Izuku replied in a deadpan tone that he was not understanding the joke even though he did well on tests, and he sounded more bored than anything else. Frustrated, Bakugo slapped his own cheek and a small backfire from his quirk left a smudge of soot on his face. He wiped it away with annoyance and cursed himself for being such an idiot. The rest of the day went on as usual until they reached All Might's class. All Might announced that they had an important assignment, a practical exam. He explained that the exam would consist of pairs of students facing off against a teacher. The idea made Izuku anxious, and he felt the ringing in his ears intensify as he tried to keep his thoughts together. He soothed himself by recalling that he used to sing to cope with stress and that others had once complimented his voice. The tune in his head shifted into determination. He wanted to prove himself and, if the day ever came, to save people in need. All Might then pulled out a box similar to the one he had used in the first practical exam. Kaminari announced that the left box held papers with teachers' names and the right box held twice as many students, and that he would not reveal the matches until the very end. He pulled out the cards, each name covered with a post-it, and then began calling them off. The narrator felt sorry for whoever had to pair with young Midoriya. Another student declared that he would be going against Bakugo and Midoriya, and panic flickered across his face. The narrator realized he had to fight him. The narrator executed a backflip onto the table while Kaminari cued some music. Mina sniffled quietly nearby and wondered aloud why she had ever let Kaminari hang out with that person. Kaminari reminded everyone the draw was completely fair, an obvious callback to his earlier complaints about Bakugo and the narrator having an advantage. Part of the narrator wished Kaminari would disappear in a puff of smoke, but another part objected after all. That person had been a major inspiration to him. He brushed the thought away, climbed down from the desk, and told Kaminari that he looked forward to beating Bakugo. From the back of the classroom, Shochan shouted a half-joking threat that raised a few laughs. As he warmed up for the match, the narrator worried at the possibilities. What if he seriously hurt Bakugo? What if he made a mistake? What if he got expelled? Bakugo remarked that the narrator was making it hard to enjoy watching him change and added that All Might was the #1 pro hero for a reason. The narrator scoffed and countered that that reason had been Endeavor and that he would rather it have been All Might. Bakugo agreed that the random draw was his own fault, and the narrator finished putting on his gear. Bakugo teased with a crude joke that the narrator ignored. The narrator explained that most people had reasons for what they did. Very few simply wanted to watch the world burn unless, like Bakugo, they wanted to crush those who had wronged them in an efficient, decisive way. When Bakugo asked what that nicest way would be, he answered that it meant defeating opponents quickly, then gave the narrator a brief, fierce hug. They both commented that they sounded uncomfortably alike. The hug became awkward for a moment, and Bakugo let go with a sigh. They had a few private seconds together, but the moment was interrupted. Aizawa had come to retrieve the narrator and told him to come along, and one of the students casually munched on popcorn as if nothing unusual were happening. The narrator zipped his suit back up and sat down beside Bakugo. Bakugo swore at the popcorn choice, then offered one. The narrator accepted a piece and asked where it came from. Bakugo explained that Momo had set up a popcorn and slushy machine. The slushies came in only blue and red, so when some students drank them their tongues turned purple. Momo had insisted they not mix the flavors. Bakugo teased the narrator for being sheltered, and the narrator protested that he was losing his character traits. The conversation turned to the stand and the crowd. Uraraka was charging people to watch the fight, and food was being sold. Rumors of betting circulated, and Bakugo described how a clever competitor had intentionally taken a fall to fleece the crowd, which made him uneasy at the idea of being seen as a criminal mastermind. They stepped out into the hallway. The narrator considered the possibility of embarrassing Bakugo in front of the school but held back. Momo arrived and greeted him awkwardly, then warned him to keep his mutterings to himself. Her expression hardened as she advised him not to underestimate All Might. Anyone with half a brain could see why, and she implied she had history with the pro-hero. The narrator noted the change in her demeanor. Momo dismissed flattery and told him, plainly, that she was a lesbian. The narrator looked puzzled. She asked if he thought she was American and teased that Denki had probably shown him a meme. She also observed that their class contained many different kinds of people. Then, in a softer tone, she said she had come to wish him good luck and added, with a brief smile, that she hoped things would go well for him personally. The narrator reflected on how quickly she could shift from sharp to kind. A classmate exclaimed in disbelief about why Bakugo was not terrified of the narrator, but she was shoved aside in the bustle of the corridor. Bakugo then snapped at Momo, using one of his usual abrasive nicknames, and the narrator leaned close and warned Bakugo in a low voice that if he did not stop she would toss him aside. Bakugo shivered and, citing recent events and other personal motives, retracted his earlier insult. The narrator hoisted him over her shoulder in a practiced motion while Bakugo protested that he had not meant for it to happen just then. As they moved toward the entrance, the narrator steadied Bakugo with a hand on his shoulder and teased him about his oversized hands. Bakugo, flustered, muttered that the narrator simply had large hands. The narrator called him Atsundra and outlined a plan. Bakugo would create a distraction with his explosions while the narrator searched elsewhere. They would make it a competition and fist-bumped before splitting up. The narrator decided to avoid the center of the arena, thinking it was the most obvious place to check first. Meanwhile, the staff in Class 1A discussed Deku's possible motives. One staff member noted Deku's bet to catch Bakugo and wondered if Deku had ulterior motives. Another student observed that Deku's actions were always carefully considered, and a teacher commented that Deku had unexpected power and liked to make things interesting. They agreed among themselves that Deku was probably counting on Bakugo to find All Might first, and that Deku's performance could be so convincing that someone experienced in body language would be the only one to see through it. 1 week remained before the school break. The narrator reflected on how she and Bakugo had lasted this long together and how his cursing was somehow growing on her despite herself. When she walked into the classroom, there was excited chatter. Uraraka asked Deku what he was doing during the break, and Deku replied that he would be working out and keeping an eye on Bakugo to make sure no one got hurt. A classmate remarked with amusement that it was nice to see Deku and Bakugo still close, recalling Bakugo's fiery first-day proclamations, and then imitating his current, softer demands for attention. Momo laughed and said the impression was spot on. Deku said he would be helping his parents with work during the break, and the others complimented him for it. Tsuyu was greeted as she arrived. Deku took his place near Hitoshi, teasing him for looking exhausted. Before he could get an answer, Aizawa entered and instructed Bakugo to sit down. Aizawa announced that instead of a break, the students would be sent to a training camp. The class groaned. Aizawa explained that the time would be better spent preparing them for what was ahead. Aizawa then mentioned test results and began passing out the papers. He said he had to attend a meeting with Principal Nizu and entrusted class leadership duties to Ida, telling anyone with philosophical questions to refer to Midoriya. As everyone flipped their papers, they realized many had earned perfect scores. Momo, surprised and nervous, revealed that she had placed second, and fretted about how her parents would react. Ida teased her about her humility, and Shinso smiled in amusement. Deku and his friends compared their ranks. Shoto had done well, Deku had a respectable placing, and Bakugo slammed his paper down in frustration at being fifth. Deku, bored, teased him not to ruin his good looks. Shoto asked about how Endeavor would react to the results, and Deku remarked that he had a contingency plan to visit Shoto's home if needed. When the subject shifted to family, Shoto mentioned his mother's unsettled state after a recent visit from a certain person. Deku offered a sympathetic smirk and an offhand remark about how problems could be made to look accidental. Shoto shoved Deku with a half-laugh and called him despicable. Suddenly, a mix of sobbing and frantic voices echoed down the corridor, followed by a flurry of running feet. Several classmates tripped and tumbled into Deku, a tightly knit group of friends who often clustered around him and Bakugo. Mina was the first to plead for Deku's help. Deku pushed the fallen students off himself with a groan and said he would help on the condition that they not injure his back. He joked about avoiding scoliosis. A chaotic outburst followed from the group, their words about personal relationships and misunderstandings rapidly escalating. Deku laughed and exaggerated his voice to defuse the tension, half mocking the melodrama. Kirishima stepped between them and made a crude, inappropriate joke, and the others reacted with embarrassment and exasperation. The moment passed without further incident. A brief lull filled the gap as everyone collected themselves and returned to the more mundane business of school life. Kirishima admitted that they had kind of failed miserably. Bakugo insisted that Izuku would get an A+++ on the retake he would inevitably have to take, then grabbed Kirishima by the collar and let his eyes go dark. Bakugo added that Deku would make sure the punishment stung and that the memory of it would be unforgettable, and he described the way some mentors train students as famously intense. Kirishima laughed nervously and asked Izuku what he meant. Izuku said he had pushed the others to study until they collapsed from exhaustion and had put Bakugo through some rough, relentless training. They argued about some embarrassing consequences of their antics in the library, and the teasing grew awkward until nearby students began to chime in. Several of the girls and some of the boys started teasing them and egging them on, and Momo murmured that it was spicy. Someone remarked that Todoroki had never seen anything like it. Kirishima cut in to say he did not think he had ever heard Izuku use a real swear word before, aside from the time he had burned his arm and screamed a lot during the incident. Bakugo insisted that he used plenty of harsh language in general, the blunt vocabulary he was known for. Izuku laughed that he preferred not to, but admitted he had slipped up once or twice. The teasing grew awkward and then subsided. Bakugo complained that the break was almost over and asked why they had to do a project. Kirishima pointed out that it was just a short research paper on a hero who had attended UA. Bakugo suspected Kirishima would use the assignment as a chance to dig up dirt on All Might. Deku smiled and said he had already finished his paper. For a moment his eyes looked sad. Kirishima teased him about it and hugged him from the side, and Deku returned the gesture with a confused expression. They noted how oddly UA organized its yearbooks by class rather than by year. Kirishima put Bakugo on his shoulders, reached for the Class 1A book on a high shelf, and they tumbled in a playful roughhousing until Kirishima caught Bakugo. Bakugo joked that carrying him was payback for some childhood teasing, and Kirishima denied the accusation. They sat at an empty table and flipped to the first page. Deku reminded them about wanting dirt on All Might, but Kirishima suggested they look into the class Aizawa had expelled the previous year. Because their most recent class photo had not been in the edition yet, the book showed the year before. As they looked through the students and their quirks, they were surprised at how capable many of them seemed. They were baffled to find that expelled students had quirks like compelling others to follow commands, reshaping their own bodies in unusual ways, and even freezing time for a few minutes. Kirishima suggested that perhaps the quirks themselves had been the reason for the expulsions. Deku leafed further through the book and pointed to a portrait where almost the entire face and the name had been scratched out, along with the quirk description. Bakugo said it looked eerie. It was not even ink, but something had been gouged from the page. From the remaining picture they could make out long blonde hair with bangs and a wide, genuine smile. The only visible letters of the name were the first and last T and O. They decided to consult Principal Nizu about the anomaly and headed straight to his office. Kirishima complimented Izuku on having softened a bit, and Deku turned bright red at the praise. Kirishima offered an earnest, heartfelt remark about how much he appreciated Deku's kindness and perspective, which made Deku blush even deeper. When they reached Nizu's door, the principal appeared behind them and commented on their easy camaraderie, inviting them in with a smile. Kirishima asked directly why Aizawa had expelled that class. Nizu explained that Aizawa had not personally made the decision. A highly respected man named Yagi had convinced the administration that some students' quirks were dangerous and potentially villainous. In hindsight, Nizu said, it had been a mistake. He mentioned that one of the students had transferred to a rival school and gone on to a successful career hosting a radio show under the name Cupid. Kirishima tried to process that the student had attended UA and trailed off. He added that there was also a missing entry in the yearbook that troubled them. Nizu asked to see the book, and they handed it to him. A moment later he looked up troubled and announced that the page in question was missing. Kirishima protested that they had only been gone for a few minutes, and Nizu showed them the yearbook with the page clearly torn out. They stood in stunned silence, unable to explain why the page had been removed. He promised he would get to the bottom of this, apologized, and after they talked some more they left. Bakugo asked if I knew Yagi and put his arms behind his head. I answered that I did not. I wanted to shout that Yagi was All Might, but I kept quiet out of respect for Aizawa. Bakugo asked if there were any new developments on the League of Losers. I explained that the hand user and I had used to play video games together, and from that I had deduced he was around 20. Bakugo asked if that was the only detail. I asked to finish and described that in my fight I had noticed the man's black hair roots and a small mole on his chin. He also appeared young and slight. Bakugo laughed and scoffed at the unexpected description. Bakugo remarked that he thought that man was supposed to be the leader. Bakugo teased further and said something sarcastic about going to complain online. I suggested we spend some time together before we left for camp, smiling. Bakugo accused me of having ulterior motives and blushed. I denied it angrily. Someone passing by scolded Bakugo for shouting in the hallway. Bakugo shot back a rude retort. He muttered that he had been planning something until I ruined the mood, hit his forearm against his face, and joked that Bakugo had caught a case of being infatuated with me. Bakugo lightly smacked my back and said it should be illegal for me to be so both cute and intimidating. I don't like swimming, especially not with other people. I asked the others to remind me why we were going to the pool. Bakugo scoffed and pointed out that I had already said that I did not like swimming. He prodded for an answer. I complained that sharing water with other people grossed me out. Bakugo teased that it might be fun in other ways, which made me balk. Someone else stammered, trying to explain for the group that it could still be useful for social observation. Kirishima told me that phrasing things nicely was better. I cleared my throat and tried to put it more plainly. Even if I wasn't interested in romantic stuff, it could be useful to interact with people. Bakugo mocked me for acting like a flawless protagonist. The others traded barbs and teasing lines, and the atmosphere stayed light and noisy. When we reached the pool, I immediately sat in a lawn chair and pulled sunglasses as if to shield myself. The others tried to coax me into the water but eventually gave up. Kaminari shouted out a birthday greeting across the pool. Left to my own devices, I reflected on how strange everything had been. The entrance exam had turned into me helping Bakugo. Trying to retrieve my quirk had given the heroes more information on the league. The tournament was about confronting everyone else's emotional baggage but my own, and my attempts to challenge All Might had mostly been for the entertainment of my classmates. The only purely selfish thing I could recall was my attempt to beat All Might, and even that had wider repercussions. I loved helping people, but I also wanted to do something for myself. Maybe this trip would let me deal with worries about my mother, Bakugo's behavior, and everything else weighing on me. Something touched my ankles. Hands grabbed me briefly and I feared the worst, but Uraraka explained it was for my own good and then tossed me into the pool. Annoyed, I decided to turn the prank back on them. I used my quirk to hold myself at the bottom and controlled the water around me to form bubbles I could breathe from, staying submerged deliberately. From the deck, classmates began to notice how long I had been down. Some of them panicked and called for help. Others, half asleep, demanded explanations about who was watching. One student shouted that it looked like I might be drowning, prompting louder alarm. The more extreme comments and crude jokes from a few were met with immediate rebukes by others. The situation escalated into wary concern rather than chaos. Underwater, I spent those minutes in quiet reflection, running through different scenarios in my head. What if I became a villain? What if I became a vigilante? What if I had always been friends with Bakugo? Or what if I had All Might's quirk? In each vision I imagined how my choices would change me, how relationships and motivations would shift, and whether I would have the heart to follow through with violent impulses. The thoughts were troubling but clarifying. A splash made me look up and I saw Bakugo slump and sink. I dove forward, grabbed beneath his shoulder, and propelled him up out of the water. I surfaced immediately as cold air hit my face. I quickly checked him for signs of breathing and began rescue compressions and mouth-to-mouth. My training kicked in. Bakugo coughed and sputtered back to consciousness. He claimed the pool had been deeper than he expected. I suggested they get a drink of water to recover. Momo had been the only one who had suspected anything was seriously wrong, and the others gathered around as we walked toward the fountain to recover and calm down. They paused by the water, unsure of what to say next. They exchanged sharp banter about the plan. Kaken accused someone of setting it up. Izuku admitted that a panic attack during the simulated emergency had shaken him and that a brief moment of comfort had helped. Izuku pushed Kaken against the wall in a teasing reprimand and left him flustered. Izuku apologized, explaining he only wanted Kaken to have fun. Kaken replied that he would call him Uraraka for a while and admitted he had enjoyed it. Someone asked how Izuku had survived under the rubble for more than 4 minutes. Kaken erupted about Izuku being a criminal mastermind and a friend told him to be quiet. Hitoshi and Izuku traded playful fingergun gestures. Izuku stepped off the bus and breathed in the fresh air. The trees were bright green and the dirt smelled like earth. He thought about collecting a sample. He looked around and saw 2 girls in cat costumes and a little boy. Kaken wrapped an arm around Izuku's shoulder and demanded to know who they were. Someone told Kaken to wait 5 minutes before being rude and explained that the costumed pair were the Wild Wilds, who, along with 2 others, had formed a 4-person joint agency. The Wilds introduced themselves and explained that they owned the land and that the students were guests. Cabins were at the foot of the mountain. Groans rose from the classmates. Ryuko pressed her paws into the dirt and the ground shifted in a sudden, dramatic tremor. Izuku saluted Kaken and dropped down past the railing as his classmates slipped and tumbled into the shifting earth. He floated safely behind Shino. Shino reminded them that the land was private, that they could use their quirks freely here, and that they had 3 hours to reach the cabins on foot, with no exceptions. They had to go through the beast forest. She wished them luck. Izuku muttered that he had been hoping to relax, and when Shino startled he reached out and steadied her. She warned him not to fall off his perch. He pushed her back to safety and accepted the rule that he could not use his quirk here. He slid down the rail and asked what he'd missed. Then he saw a giant monster approaching and felt a grin spread across his face. Before anyone could fully react, Izuku sprinted forward, dodged the creature's attack, climbed onto its arm, and scrambled up to its back. He immobilized the creature with a precise grapple and finished with a dramatic, athletic landing that drew a stunned silence from the onlookers. Someone noted the moment might come up again later as a joke, and Izuku acknowledged the tease. Now that everyone had seen a demonstration, it was their turn. Izuku could tell the display had unsettled some classmates. Kiri hesitated, reluctant to harm creatures that resembled his own kind, and another student urged him to be more forceful. One of the beasts dashed past and went straight for Kiri. The student steeled himself and fought back. Soon multiple beasts converged, and despite the strain and the number of opponents, the group worked together in coordinated efforts that felt almost like choreography. Izuku reminded himself not to forget it was supposed to be a vacation. By the 2.5-hour mark, Izuku was tired. The monsters were not especially formidable, but there were many of them. He had a sore cheek and a thumb that had popped out of place from a misjudged punch when a creature evaded him at the last moment and his momentum carried his hand awkwardly. He reset his thumb and kept moving. An instructor announced that Koda would be staying with them for a week and encouraged introductions. Izuku stepped forward and introduced himself as Izuku Midoriya, offering a friendly greeting and some quick tips when he noticed Koda's fist. He suggested pressing the thumb against the knuckles to avoid injury. Koda scoffed and said he had no intention of associating with heroes, a bluntness that showed his mistrust in a child who had experienced loss. Kaken and another student argued quietly nearby. Someone decided to head to the springs and asked if anyone wanted to join. When Izuku arrived at the springs, he took the chance to relax. He almost dozed when something purple flickered at the edge of his vision. A commotion by the window startled everyone. A hot ember had been thrown, striking the area and causing Koda to stumble and slide down the wall. He landed on the ground with a smear of blood on his face from a nosebleed, looking dazed. Izuku hurried over and caught him, scolding him gently to be more careful and announcing that he would take Koda to the hospital ward if anyone needed him. He wrapped a towel around Koda and guided him to the infirmary. After explaining what had happened to Shino, Izuku sat and listened as Shino reassured him that Koda would be fine by morning. Izuku sighed and admitted that sometimes he saw an exact carbon copy of himself in Koda. Shino corrected him sharply, reminding him that Koda's parents had died in their line of work as heroes, and that the boy believed his parents had abandoned him. Izuku quieted at the revelation. Shino grew more frustrated and argued that Izuku could not truly understand Koda's feelings because Izuku appeared to have a support system. She snapped that Izuku's assumptions were wrong and that she herself struggled constantly with the burden of other people's baggage while rarely facing her own. My quirk had not always been like this. He remembered being bullied for dreaming of becoming a hero and being told to kill himself. He took a deep breath and explained that he was dating someone he had helped reform, someone who had once been consumed by anger and wanted to hurt anyone in his way. Koda stammered that the narrator just seemed different. The narrator admitted he had sociopathic tendencies but insisted he was not a sociopath. He used a coping method that kept him appearing happier. He explained that his partner wanted to shut the world out for what it had done to him, but could not, so he lashed out at people who reminded him of that trauma, especially heroes. The narrator patted Koda on the head and, referring to the sports festival and the news, said that Izuku Midoriya was very charismatic, excellent at fighting, kind, and possessed one of the strongest quirks the narrator had seen in a long time. Koda confessed that he had a habit of bottling up his emotions and then letting them spill out to people who did not ask for it. The narrator offered to be there as a senior if Koda ever needed someone to talk to. At that moment, Katsuki Bakugo entered and said that the narrator already had a boyfriend to talk to. The narrator smiled, thanked him, and mentioned that falling from that height would probably leave a headache in the morning. They left the clinic together. The narrator hugged Bakugo's arm. Bakugo asked if the narrator wanted to talk, clearly wanting to ask about the narrator's father. The narrator said maybe tomorrow and that he wanted to enjoy the day. Bakugo nodded, pulled him closer, and then accused him of stalking. The narrator admitted he had just been listening and suggested they go eat, adding that he was starving. He yawned and looked at the clock on the wall. 3 a.m. He thought about how people wasted a third of their lives sleeping and tiptoed to the kitchen. After a while he found bread, eggs, an avocado, strawberries, blueberries, bananas, and milk. He made a light breakfast of avocado toast and a milkshake, and although he usually ate more, he did not feel like it that morning. He put on his headphones and went for a run. By the time he returned it was about 6. The run had felt strangely eerie, like walking alone in a dark neighborhood where screaming would not bring anyone, yet he had the sensation of being watched. The only people who knew about that place were Class 1A, 1B, their teachers, and the wild pussycats. He went to the lounge area and Uraraka called his name, startling him. He hid his reaction well. Uraraka apologized and asked when he had woken up. He replied that he had been awake around 3. Uraraka exclaimed that he needed proper sleep, and he used his quirk briefly to close her mouth, then stopped when she face-bombed. She said they would train in half an hour. He prepared himself mentally. They were scheduled to train with Class 1B. When he went outside, someone greeted him by saying he was late. He explained that he had been running since 3 a.m. and that only 5 people were present. Shinso, who did not seem to need sleep, Todoroki, who did not care much for himself, Uraraka, who had just woken up, Monoma, who liked to prove himself, and Kendo, who was there to make sure he did not do anything reckless. Shoji whispered to Hitoshi that Deku seemed too irritable to talk to. The narrator scowled and waited for the rest of their classmates to arrive. He wondered why he was in such a bad mood and decided it was probably because he had spilled his soul out earlier. Emotions felt like faulty sensors in his brain giving the wrong response most of the time. An inner voice piped up that it was not all bad, and he wondered if lack of sleep was making him frantic. When everyone arrived, they walked into the forest. Kendo asked how they could possibly train with all the different quirk types. The narrator explained that the best method was to go beyond one's limit. If someone pushed past their limit, their body would adapt and create a new limit to compensate. The others reacted with confused faces. He observed how everyone trained. Shoji regulated the temperature of water with his quirk, Bakugo pushed his heat tolerance by exposing his palms to intense heat in a controlled way, Momo and Sato snacked, and Tsuyu climbed and practiced mobility. He needed to clear his head, But when Kirishima surprised him, he accidentally created a ring of fire around himself. He turned it off quickly and noticed he had been wearing an intense, disappointed expression. Kirishima, for his part, had a nervous, blushing look. The narrator grunted and tried to herd his emotions back into place as the voices around him blurred into meaningless noise. Then he heard Bakugo, in a rough attempt at motivation, suggest that the narrator was weak. That comment snapped something. He erupted in anger and began to shout, but before he could finish the tirade he lost control and unleashed a massive burst of flames that swept across the training area in a dramatic, destructive wave. He immediately retracted the fire and let it dissipate. The sight of what he had done left him shaken in a way that felt like a stutter. Kirishima approached to help steady him. The narrator announced that he would go into the woods to meditate and warned with intense seriousness that he did not want to be disturbed. He walked until he came upon a small pond fed by a waterfall. Standing at the water's edge, he admitted to himself that he wanted power. He then took a step onto the surface of the water. He guessed he hadn't cooled down much. Steam still rose from his shoes. He walked into the middle of the pond and sat in double lotus. As he settled into holding himself in that spot, his facial muscles relaxed. This was what training his quirk felt like, not only building strength but gaining control, learning to tune his body to match it. The surroundings were peaceful, nothing but the sounds of the creek and nearby wildlife. He thought maybe tomorrow he could try to use it with the rest of the group. He didn't know it was possible, but he must have fallen asleep while using his quirk. It had felt like only a few minutes, but when he opened his eyes it was already dark. From the trees he heard someone call his name. Kaminari, Momo, and Hagakure emerged and headed toward him. Momo asked what he was doing in the creek, her expression mixing disappointment and curiosity. Kaminari teased that he had been trying to be like Jesus and added, half joking, that he was very cultured. Hagakure, scratching at her hair, reminded him that their boyfriend was waiting and urged them to come eat. He explained that he had been regulating his quirk to float on water. Hagakure insisted they go eat. Momo mentioned that Bakugo had asked after him earlier. Kaminari and Momo bantered about relationships in their usual teasing way. Hagakure asked if they were coming to dinner, and as they walked back to the campsite Izuku kept feeling like he was being watched. After changing into fresh clothes he met everyone outside. Mina noted that he had seemed tense earlier. Bakugo made a teasing remark about how he had been acting, and Izuku cut him off with a light rebuke about Bakugo's bedtime routine. Mina, Shiro, and Kaminari wheezed with laughter at the exchange. Bakugo reacted with mock hurt and playfully made a show of complaining. At the grill station Uraraka and Momo were having a small argument about starting a fire. Momo questioned Uraraka's preparedness for hero work if she did not know how to light a fire, and Uraraka challenged Momo to do it herself. Izuku stepped in to break up the argument and teased that he had detected a bit of drama coming from their direction. Uraraka looked offended while Momo brushed off the teasing. Momo suggested that they should stop acting like Bakugo and Izuku were a couple, and Uraraka's face went bright red when reminded of the rumors. Izuku noticed their embarrassment and decided to help by demonstrating a simple fire-starting technique. He tied dried grass to the ends of a bent stick, twisted the grass, inserted another stick through the loop, and used friction until sparks appeared. Momo admitted it was a surprisingly useful skill, and Izuku felt a nervous flush. He could not let them know more than they needed to. He replied that knowledge was never a bad thing, and the girls accepted that, moving on to get dinner ready. Bakugo teased that Izuku could not cook, ruffled his hair, and then wrapped an arm around his shoulder in a rare, gentler moment. Izuku protested and Bakugo smiled, but then made a sudden, inappropriate motion that flustered Izuku. A brief neutral pause followed as everyone adjusted and focused back on dinner preparations. Kaminari and Hitoshi had messy hair and shirts, and Ida chastised them in his usual stiff manner, lamenting that he was a terrible parent for letting such delinquents run around. Bakugo shot back at Ida with the usual rivalry banter. The rest of the night passed without incident until they started clearing up. Bakugo reported that he was nearly done cooking and Izuku mentioned that he had washed the dishes that had been used. Izuku hugged Bakugo from behind and whispered something playful that made Bakugo almost spit into the soup. Bakugo warned him to stop and Izuku apologized, and then went to set up the table. After he finished setting up, a call for Koda echoed from the campsite. Someone called that it was time for dinner, but he kept walking away. The narrator looked down at the plate of untouched food and felt their stomach growl. They told themselves it did not matter, then picked up the plate and followed him. When he sat on the ledge of a cliff, the narrator heard his stomach growl as well. He scoffed that he had heard it and offered the narrator some curry he had brought. The narrator asked how he had found the place, and he admitted that he had followed the narrator's footprints to make sure they ate before the food got cold. He turned to face the narrator and told them to get lost because he did not want company and asked them to forget about his secret hideout. The narrator smirked and walked to the edge to sit down, saying that now that he had told them not to come, they thought they would stay. He protested that it was unfair, but the narrator laughed and teased that telling someone not to do something was the surest way to make them do it. The narrator told him that if he did not sit down soon, they might have to spoon-feed the curry. He fell silent, and the narrator thought it was time to work on the impression of being a sociopath. The narrator then asked if his parents had been the water hose heroes and said they had heard what had happened to them, calling it tragic. He reacted with shock and demanded to know who had told the narrator. The narrator said no one in particular and claimed to know many things, some they should and some they should not. The narrator asked him to sit and shared that they remembered a time when they hated what the world had done to them and how it had torn them up inside. They admitted that they had once wanted to set the world on fire out of spite, but that they had learned to accept that sometimes the world simply was like that. He reluctantly sat down next to the narrator and called people stupid for the way they fought and focused on quirks, saying that if people had not been showing off they would still be alive. The narrator said they had finally found someone who thought like them, and then clarified that they believed someone should be a hero to help people. They said that if people acted heroically for selfish reasons, that did not justify killing them, and that although their instincts were usually right, something told them the person who had murdered his parents had done it for amusement. He flared with anger and told the narrator that they had no idea what they were talking about and asked who would kill for fun. The narrator reflected, a little surprised he had not replied then. The next day had been ordinary until the end. The teams had been forming for a fun game when the League of Villains attacked, and the narrator had hoped for a break from their problems. They were informed that Koda was still up on the mountain, and the narrator refused to let Koda die, starting to run through the woods. The narrator admitted they were not good with directions, but they reached the mountain more easily than expected. There was an odd smell in the air that mixed chemical notes with the scent of a new uniform, and the narrator mentioned, more to themselves than anyone else, that they knew what toxic chemicals smelled like in odd detail. Being a vigilante had always been their second option, and they tried to stop themselves from fuming. Looking back, they thought their flames must have helped clear the air. As they reached the top, the villain holding Koda showed a mixture of anger and fear and grabbed Koda by the hair. The narrator decided to act. They summoned a controlled burst of flame that sent the attacker stumbling back and releasing Koda. The attacker clutched at his arm in surprise and stumbled, and the narrator wore a smirk that belonged more to a theatrical antagonist than a hero. They intended to intimidate the man rather than cause lasting harm. The attacker corrected the narrator's insult with a sharp retort of his own, and the narrator said that the attacker was exactly who they had been looking for. Koda started to run forward, but the narrator pushed him behind them to keep him safe and told him to enjoy the show while warning that the first rows might get splashed by the spectacle. The narrator spoke in a performative tone, hoping Koda understood it was an act and not meant to scar him. They told the attacker that despite being a so-called hero, they seemed willing to cross a line. When the attacker asked whether that had not been clear, the narrator said it had and suggested the attacker consider himself a warm-up round for the real fight. They created a ring of flames as a dramatic barrier and explained that while some people assumed extreme hero ideologies meant hatred for villains, it was specifically the thoughtless cruelty of villains like him that they loathed those who were strong enough to be dangerous but lacked anything interesting or honorable. That insult seemed to push the attacker over the edge. He sprinted at the narrator with a raised fist, yelling a challenge. The narrator ducked under the blow, slipped around him, and gestured toward the ring of flame. The attacker paused, anger flaring as the narrator taunted him, but the narrator kept the tone provocative rather than cruel, goading him to act if he truly believed in his own strength. The attacker's bravado broke, and he began to laugh in a high, strained way before stepping back, the confrontation unresolved for the moment. Midoriya thought the man must be a glutton for punishment if he wanted him dead so badly. He let a small flame flicker behind him for effect and told himself this was his sociopathic moment. He felt, for a second, undeniably badass. Koda took a step back, stammering that if Midoriya killed him, Midoriya could never become a hero, and demanded to know what he planned to do. Midoriya dismissed it as a tantrum and closed the distance. He drove his momentum into a kick that sent Koda tumbling into the mountainside, leaving a shallow crater. Midoriya watched until Koda's form stopped moving and then, after a few long seconds, heard soft breathing. It dropped to his knees, relieved and exhausted, muttering that the acting had been the hardest part. Koda called out Izuku's name with a trembling voice. Midoriya rose and gathered him in a hug, reassuring him that it had been a ruse and that no one would hurt him. Koda's eyes brimmed with tears as he admitted he had thought he was going to die, and then confessed he had feared Midoriya might die too. Midoriya teased that he hadn't realized Koda cared so much about heroes, and Koda playfully punched him in the side, explaining that after being saved, of course he had worried. Midoriya joked that he had the power to tame any demon, and Koda wrapped the top of his head in mock annoyance. They walked through the forest in a tense silence, listening for any sign that someone else remained. The place felt too quiet for a location that had just been attacked. Midoriya tried to ignore the pain in his leg worse than what he had endured before, but he forced himself to keep moving so Koda would not worry and give the villains an opening. Stress and adrenaline built until he broke into a full sprint despite the injury. He slammed into a group of people and called Shino's name before his legs finally gave out and he collapsed into her arms. Shino asked what had happened. Midoriya told her the League of Villains was here. When she asked who that was, he explained that the League of Villains had attacked. Shino's expression shifted to relief when she saw Koda on Midoriya's shoulders and she exclaimed that Koda was all right. A figure rose behind her at that moment. Midoriya shoved Shino out of the way and threw a harsh uppercut that sent the attacker stumbling backward, clutching at his face before collapsing. Midoriya wiped his face and grimaced at the unpleasantness. The attacker tried to force the situation by demanding that Midoriya come with them and that he bring his blonde friend, or else others would be hurt. Midoriya met the demand with action. He struck the man, swept his ankle, and then pinned him to the ground with his foot. Shino scrambled to help, fearing that Midoriya was putting too much weight on his injured leg and worried he might cause serious harm. Midoriya eased Koda off his shoulders and methodically delivered a precise, non-lethal blow that rendered the assailant unconscious. The panicked noise around them dropped away. Shino scolded him for acting so harshly in front of a child. Midoriya apologized and said he needed to go look for Kaken. Shino called after him that the villains were after him and asked who Kaken was. Midoriya mentally winced at having used the nickname, but there was no time for that now. A public announcement reached them, identifying intruders who were searching for Midoriya and someone named Kaken and urging everyone to protect them at all costs. Midoriya bristled at being singled out for protection but pushed the thought aside and focused on a new, urgent problem: a spreading arson attack in the woods. The blaze burned with an unusually hot, blue light that caught Midoriya's attention in a way he could not resist. He tried to lift and disperse the flames, but though the fire felt light, there was too much of it and the effort was quickly wearing him down. He followed the trail of blue flame to its origin and found the person responsible: a gaunt man with dark hair, striking blue eyes, and purple-toned, scarred skin held together in places by metal staples. Midoriya noted that dumpsters were one thing, but setting a forest on fire was another. The man sighed and, with an almost bored expression, stepped away and began to run. As he fled, he set more trees alight. Midoriya moved to stop him and formed a wall of fire to contain the spread, calling out that it was over. Before he could get anywhere, Aizawa appeared and wrapped him in bandages, pulling him clear of the flames and away from the danger. Aizawa scolded Midoriya for his reckless actions and told him to go find Bakugo and try to reason with him, insisting that without Midoriya Bakugo would likely go off on his own. Midoriya opened his mouth to argue, but then fell silent as they moved away from the burning trees and towards safer ground. Aizawa was strong, And even though he had beaten All Might in a fight, the narrator was not sure he could beat Izuku now. His quirk, however, seemed well suited to this fight. He forced himself to ignore second thoughts and nodded. After a minute of running with burning lungs, he gave himself a Mario-style jump boost and looked for a crowd. To the right and about 100 feet up, there was a gathering. He accelerated toward it and ended up stepping in front of his friends. Achiko informed him that Bakugo had been taken and that they had managed to get Tokoyami back, but there was trouble. A girl with messy buns charged at him wearing a strange device at her neck and wielding knives. She introduced herself as Toga. Instinctively, he produced the switchblade from his pocket. He used it to redirect both of her wrists to the right, struck her in the nose to create an opening, and kicked her back. She rolled toward her allies, wiping at a nose that was bleeding. Her expression turned almost Yandere. She commented that he was the full package for having beaten Mr. Staney and knowing how to use guns. He had already moved behind a small group of villains. A man in a black suit spouting nonsense, another pale man who seemed anxious, and the primary target he had been trailing. Deciding that the largest threat had to be stopped, he opened the switchblade and delivered a quick, disabling strike that put the man out of the fight without any graphic detail. He told the man that he had come to enjoy a break and would not let him waste his time, then kicked him to force the blade free. If Toga had not been injured, he suspected she would have rushed him impulsively. The man dropped a blue orb, which burst and released Kaken. The narrator called Kaken's name and tried to reach him, but Spinner struck him with the hilt of a sword and rendered him unconscious. The scene that followed is recalled from the boyfriend's perspective. He opened his eyes to see a frog-like villain looming over their classmates. He asked where Deku was, feeling weak despite not having fought much. When he looked up, he saw more villains and Deku being held. He demanded, in harsh tones, that the man holding Deku hand him over before he intervened. Deku was limp, mostly unconscious and peaceful in appearance. A rough-looking villain warned him not to step forward. The purple mist formed and another villain grabbed Deku and pulled him toward a portal. The boyfriend implored them not to take Deku, but a round-faced person restrained him before the smoke cleared. He dropped to his knees and cried, overwhelmed the first time he had ever cried in front of someone who was not Deku. He began to come to in an empty room. He was in a bed and got up on impulse, partly thinking that being cooperative might make any questioning or interrogation go more smoothly. He explored the room and found video games, consoles, and a bottle of lotion. He sat back down on the bed and crossed his legs. A moment later, the door opened. Dabi and Shigaraki entered and closed the door behind them. Shigaraki noted that they would not try to wake him, and the narrator muttered that it was already too late. Dabi observed that the narrator had even made the bed, a small sign of order. The narrator told them to hurry with their questioning because his vacation had been ruined and he had missed time with his boyfriend. Toga covered his mouth and gave a sadistic grin, warning that it would be bad if everyone else found out he was here. Dabi said darkly that would force them to take severe action. The mood tightened, but the narrator softened the tension by offering to bandage Dabi's neck before he accidentally worsened any irritation. He realized that the lotion was likely meant to soothe the neck rather than for any other purpose. Toga and Dabi giggled at the misunderstanding. When Dabi protested that the narrator had no right to judge him, the narrator reached out and held Dabi's hand to the injured area. He said he was not judging, but speculated that Dabi's self-harm was a coping mechanism tied to pressure from a father figure and to the emotional stress of the situation, and that pressuring someone who was already fragile was either a form of cruelty or obliviousness. There was a short silence. Toga broke it by asking which psychologist had given the narrator their credentials. The narrator replied that he had diagnoses for each of them and confidently stated that they were at an abandoned bar on a specific coordinate. The villains looked at him wide-eyed. Shigaraki asked how I had known that. I explained that it had been one of 5 places I thought it could be and that I had been lucky. I added that luck had been a friend of mine, though she had not always been kind. Shigaraki suggested they not get depressing and asked if anyone wanted to play Street Fighter. I agreed and he turned on the TV and the console. Toga grew visibly excited and offered to bring snacks. Dabi volunteered to bring blankets. Shigaraki, annoyed, told them this was not a sleepover. They all fell quiet, then spoke in unison, pitying me for not knowing what a sleepover was. Dabi, irritated, pointed out that they had all had rough childhoods but at least knew what a sleepover entailed, and he asked about my own past. I told them I had been emotionally abused by my peers and that they had driven me into dark thoughts. I explained that someone who had been close to me at one point had also been unstable, and that hiding my quirk had felt like the only option because I feared people would only want me for it. I admitted that I had not hidden my love of heroes and my ambition to be one, and that had drawn more of the wrong kind of attention. Dabi bristled at the idea that anyone would bully me, saying I seemed too kind to deserve that. When Shigaraki demanded names of those who had hurt me, I raised an eyebrow, and Shigaraki warned that no one would disrespect his friend. Toga came up behind me and the atmosphere shifted. I felt her possessive aura return. She demanded to know who had hurt me and threatened, in a dramatic, exaggerated way, to make them regret it. I changed the subject, asking Toga to gather their things, and she pleaded for one more long hug, remarking that I smelled of vanilla and coconut. I glanced at Shigaraki and asked if she was really going to eat me. He confirmed, wryly, that she joked about eating everyone. They left the room to collect their things. Shigaraki then asked how I felt about having a little brother, clearly astonished, and I laughed and patted him on the back. He explained, based on his research, that my real name was likely Tenko Shimura and that, since All for One was a father figure to me, I might have a younger brother in that family. He seemed confused and then the others returned, announcing their arrival. Toga sat down in front of me with a bag of food and listed the contents: caramel-covered popcorn, every kind of chocolate, and sugary candy. After a short silence, I asked if she had pixie sticks, and she nodded enthusiastically. Shigaraki popped the game disc in and handed me a controller. Dabi draped a blanket over us both and joked that one side was for older members and the other was for his new brother. After an hour or two of playing, they put on The Little Mermaid because Dabi said he liked Ariel for standing up to her father. Watching them, I realized these people were not so bad. If the world were like this circle, I would not mind. Too bad they would probably find me eventually. I told myself murder was wrong, but these were just kids who had not known better. They all fell asleep before I did. I could have left, but I chose instead to get up quietly, lock the door, and crawl back into the pillow fort that had become my spot. The night was harder to fall asleep than I expected. Being surrounded by 3 dangerous people who now insisted I was theirs and must be protected at all costs made me feel oddly safe, and also obligated to protect them if our class ever came looking for me. I suspected I could fabricate something if I needed to. I thought about Toga and how she had likely been expelled, how that and her unstable quirk had pushed her down the wrong path. If she had stayed in school, she might have had a different trajectory, perhaps something like the positive attention Shinso had earned from Aizawa. I thought about Shigaraki, or Tenko, and how he had been physically and emotionally abused by his father, which had led him to a violent turning point. After surviving on the streets, All for One had likely taken him under his wing and raised him within a life of villainy. Dabi remained a mystery to me. I knew him as Tuya Todoroki and knew the Todoroki family had suffered in their own ways, but I did not know why he had ended up separated from his siblings. When I rose from the pile of sleeping bodies, I carried each of them to the bed one at a time and placed a blanket over them. They were light, and I suspected neglect had left them somewhat malnourished. I did not enjoy cleaning, but I found that when I woke up early I liked to clean. Without my phone, I spent the morning organizing their video games. There was something therapeutic about putting a collection of things I loved into order. Since the games were scattered, I arranged them alphabetically. In the process, I remembered that Dabi had hung his large coat on a rack. I slipped my hand into its pockets and pulled out 2 items, my gifted switchblade and his phone. I did not pry, but I pressed his thumb to the home button to wake the device and glanced at his messages. There were only a few contacts listed with strange nicknames and family names, which I deduced to be his siblings and relatives. I put the phone back in his pocket instead of reading further. About an hour later I had finished cleaning. I looked over at the bed and watched as Dabi began to stir. He flailed his hand at the empty space beside him before shooting upright, then stopped, relaxed, and sighed with relief when he realized where he was. Izuku noted that it was around 3 in the morning and asked Tuya why he was still awake. Tuya replied that he did not like sleep, calling it a waste of time and admitting he had developed adjustment insomnia from all the recent changes in his life and the new things he had been discovering about himself. He added that each new revelation left him feeling overwhelmed and resentful. Izuku told him not to get nihilistic and offered to talk. Tuya sat on the edge of the bed, legs spread and elbows resting on his knees in a posture meant to project casual confidence. Izuku stepped in front of him and said he wanted to talk about Tuya Todoroki, claiming he already knew a lot. Tuya stammered for an explanation and Izuku smirked, teasing that he had expected Tuya not to ask questions. He leaned in conspiratorially and listed what he had learned. He had seen photos through Tuya's little brother, he knew about the family history of a fire quirk and the vulnerability to it, and he had heard from Shoto about the injuries Tuya had sustained and noticed burn patterns during their brief fight in the forest. Tuya reacted with a mixture of disbelief and amusement as Izuku continued, saying that some of the details came from family sources and that he was trying to piece it together. Izuku then recounted certain events as he remembered them. He recalled that on a cold night in January, when Tuya had been about 15, Tuya had left home after brief goodbyes to his siblings and his mother and had an angry public moment with his father. Tuya had kept a low profile after that, but when the news about Stain surfaced, Tuya began to follow the villain's actions and took an interest in him. That interest escalated into a confrontation in which Shoto had nearly been seriously hurt by a blade, and Tuya had intervened using his quirk to create a burst of flame. Izuku reminded Tuya that they had first met even earlier at a party, where Tuya had given him a butterfly knife as a sarcastic token of thanks for embarrassing Tuya's father in the media. Tuya looked shocked and had trouble finding words. Izuku challenged him to deny it, addressing him formally as Todoroki-san. Tuya let out a small, forced laugh and called Izuku a shifty bsrd. Izuku shrugged that it ran in his family and pushed a strand of hair behind his ear, noting he needed a haircut. He told Tuya he should try to get some sleep and joked that he could have gone out and brought back donuts instead. Tuya asked why Izuku behaved the way he did, and Izuku asked what he meant. Tuya said Izuku treated them all like friends and seemed to take their dangerous reputations lightly, reminding him that they were villains who could hurt him. Izuku answered that Tuya might think he was in control, but that Izuku felt like the central character of his own story and it was too early to give up. He admitted he wasn't the most popular character and that annoyed him, then shifted to a more nervous expression before changing the subject. A new voice suddenly demanded that everyone be quiet because it was 2 a.m. Toga apologized playfully for being melodramatic and said she did not know what time it was. When Tuya opened his mouth to retort, he hesitated and closed it. Izuku told Toga she had insomniac duties tonight, and she pouted, complaining that she had been pushed off the bed earlier. In response, she slipped off the bed with a blanket and produced something that looked like a candy from her pajama pocket. She tossed it aside, moved quickly, and covered Izuku's mouth to stop him from waking the others. Tenko and Tuya relaxed into sleep shortly afterward. Izuku suggested the least she could have done was put the others on the bed, and when there was a small thud he grabbed Tuya and slung him over his shoulder. He arranged them awkwardly on the bed so they could all sleep without fuss. Toga hugged Izuku to the ground, happy and teasing. Izuku pushed her lightly and called her sassy, and she answered by teasing that she should be treated more like a senior. She then pointed out that, if Izuku hadn't been expelled, he would now be in class 2A, which made Izuku wince. Toga laughed that the school yearbooks were not well organized and delighted in Izuku's discomfort. Toga promised to research him more, and Izuku joked about being a loser with no social media. She grabbed his shirt and pulled close enough to be breath to breath, making a mock threat that sounded severe. Izuku gave an incredulous look and softened her warning into a teasing rebuke. Toga admitted that she had been bullied in middle school for being frightening and had gotten into fights and trouble because of that reputation. Izuku listened and, after she launched an accusatory jest about stabbing, he deflected it into a calmer observation that she had a dangerous reputation rather than dwelling on specifics. Toga declared she was going to get food and ran for the door, but someone moved to block her with a hand on her shoulder to keep things orderly. Izuku then walked quietly down the hall, butterfly knife folded and concealed, and stumbled into the kitchen searching for a snack. On the bar table he found a plate of sandwiches with a note beside it. The note apologized for not letting her children bring healthier options and hoped that real food would satisfy her hunger. She flipped the note over, grabbed a pen from the counter, and wrote back thanking them and joking that they had only tried to kill each other twice, which was a huge improvement. She balanced the plate on her head, feeling the adrenaline thrum through her. If she dropped it now and someone heard, trouble would follow. As she walked down the hallway toward the door, someone stopped her. A lanky figure who introduced himself as Moonfish complained that it was 3 in the morning and asked what she was doing up. She told him sharply to leave her alone and threatened to throw him back into the place she had dragged him from if he kept pestering her. He swallowed audibly and backed away. When she opened the door and set the tray down, a pillow sailed into her face. Toga protested that she did not sound like the nickname someone had given her and told her not to yell. Another of the group complained about a stiff neck and asked what they were going to do about joining the league or getting rescued. She responded by flicking him on the forehead. She said they would fight when it came to it and made it clear she would not force anyone to abandon the people who had taken them in. Toga flung her hands up and collapsed back onto the comforter, accusing her of being too nonchalant. She laughed and explained that she stayed nonchalant so she could cope with trauma without breaking down. When she woke up next, she found herself bound to a chair. Panic flared. Tuya, Toga, and Tenko were in their villain outfits, and the mood shifted to one of confrontation. Her body felt numb. She noticed bruises and faint marks, shallow enough that they looked like they would heal without scarring. Someone had applied numbing agent, which explained the dull ache. Her smirk alerted the others that she was awake. Tenko launched into a tirade about fake heroes, arguing that many heroes were in it for money and power, and that heroes stifled real talent with performative acts. He invited her to join them, asking why she did not. She answered with a list of barbs about their companions, taunting some of them, defending one she refused to criticize and insisted she would not join them. Silence stretched, then Toga pointed behind her and asked about Kurogiri. She dismissed the suggestion lightly, saying Kurogiri was one of the coolest among them. One of the group said he'd like to rough someone up for stabbing him in the back. She denied remembering such an incident and the man exploded in anger, incredulous that she could not recall it. Tension built. She admitted to feeling a dark urge to lash out, but kept it in check. Then she began asking practical questions aloud about trackers and how long it would take to detect or reverse one. The others looked confused. She answered herself that depending on the device it could vary from minutes to days. Glancing at the clock, she wondered aloud how long it would take to get to the hero headquarters. A sudden explosion tore open a section of the wall, and Kamui Woods, the tree hero, stepped through the breach. All Might arrived moments later, filling the space with a booming speech about justice. While the heroes spoke, she quietly charred some of the wood and weakened the restraints around her, preparing for the next move. She stomped on a remaining splinter of wood that hadn't burned and pushed off, aiming a punch at Tenko as the board gave way with a crack. All Might shouted for less talk and more action. An unfamiliar gray shimmer washed over the room and the other villains vanished, leaving her body half submerged in the strange effect. Faced with the choice of losing part of herself or being drawn into whatever that place was, she braced herself, plugged her nose, and plunged. She forced herself through and found the other side to be a shifting, shimmering space that felt like a cross between liquid and light. It was disorienting and strange, but she moved through it, driven by the need to get away. I make it out the other side and everyone is confused. It takes me a moment to sort through my thoughts, but I connect the dots. Kinoshita Haruki is a villain who has recently gone missing. He was found days later seriously injured and without his quirk. His quirk could transport anyone to his location and back, essentially a weaker version of Kurogiri. There are very few people who can steal quirks. People like me if I can get the right chemical, all for one, and others who work in hospitals handling quirks for procedures. I fling myself upward and notice the air pressure isn't right. My flames will be weaker, which means more people are here. I gauge where the lack of airflow is coming from and my eye is immediately drawn to a crack-stained dark red. It is him. I give a small, unsettling smile at the crack and force my attention away to avoid giving anything away. Finally the man of the hour arrives and I smirk. If my theory is correct, and I hope with everything I have that it is, this fight shouldn't be that big of an issue. Maybe a few broken bones, maybe something worse, but I feel confident in my abilities. All Might was strong and I beat him before, but he was clever. He could outthink me. Still, if I'm right, I shouldn't die. The man comes out clapping, wearing a villainous tuxedo, and he seems oblivious to how his odd face undermines the aesthetic. He applauds and tells Izuku that he is remarkably skilled in fighting but not heroic, and offers him the chance to join the League of Villains. I laugh awkwardly to the side and make a snarky remark about their mother calling about child support. I inhale. I dry the ground with my flames and then pressurize it to crack, causing the stone around us to splinter. My eyes glow bright green as I shout a battle cry and launch my attack. It should be fine to use my quirk here, I tell myself. If quirks are forbidden in normal life, then in a situation like this it ought to be allowed. Besides, I'm the UA golden child, the fan favorite. There's no way they'll throw me in jail. I grab a chunk of rubble and ignite it. The ember shoots toward my father like a flaming comet, but things are never that simple. His right arm balloons into a massive, spiky limb, an unnerving transformation that looks like something from a nightmare. The oversized hand bats the rock aside with overwhelming force, showing me I'm in more trouble than I thought. He taunts me, telling me that if I had been a villain I could have finished him in an instant, that I could make a real difference in the world by abandoning rules, and that I never should have had a quirk because my resolve is weak. He is trying to provoke me.